The arrow came out of nowhere and split the air beside Cale Ashbourne's face, so close that it cut a thin line across his cheek before burying itself in the wooden pillar behind him. The great hall fell silent. Blood traced a slow path down his jaw, but Cale did not flinch. He did not even blink. His golden eyes swept the crowded room, past the frozen nobles and the trembling servants, until they landed on a young guard near the far window, standing with a crossbow still raised and shaking in his hands. "Explain," Cale said. His voice was quiet, but it filled every corner of the hall. The guard's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked down at the weapon in his hands as though he could not understand how it had gotten there. Then, from behind him, a second man moved, pushing the guard aside and running for the side door. Cale moved faster. One moment he stood by the pillar with blood on his cheek. The next, he was across the hall, his hand closing around the fleeing man's throat, lifting him off his feet with ease. The crowd gasped and stepped back, giving them space, the way people always did around their king when his temper rose. "Who sent you?" Cale asked. The man clawed at Cale's wrist, gasping, his face turning a deep shade of red. He said nothing, either out of loyalty or fear of something worse than the king's grip. "I will ask once more," Cale said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "Who sent you to kill me in my own hall, in front of my own people?" Still nothing. Cale's eyes flickered, just for a moment, gold bleeding into something darker, something older, the wolf beneath the man rising close to the surface. The assassin's eyes went wide with terror, and finally, words tumbled out of him in a panicked rush. "The Draven Pack," he choked out. "They paid us. They said if the king dies without an heir, the throne falls into chaos, and they will be the ones to pick up the pieces." Cale studied him for a long moment, then let him drop to the floor, where he collapsed in a heap, coughing and gasping for air. "Take him to the cells," Cale said to his guards, who rushed forward at once, "and find out who else was paid." As the guards dragged the two men away, murmurs broke out across the hall, nobles turning to whisper to each other behind raised hands. This was the third attempt on the king's life in 2 months. Each time, the attackers had come from a different direction, using different methods, but the message behind them was always the same. The Draven Pack wanted the Blackthorn throne, and they were growing bolder in their attempts to take it. Cale touched the cut on his cheek and looked at the blood on his fingers with something close to boredom. 3 attempts in 2 months, and none of them had come close enough to matter. He almost wished one of them would try harder. At least it would make the days feel less predictable. "My king," came a voice at his side. Cale turned to see Garrick, his oldest friend and most trusted advisor, standing with his arms crossed and his expression tight with worry. Garrick had been at Cale's side since they were boys running through the training yards together, and in all those years, Cale had rarely seen him look this troubled. "I am fine, Garrick," Cale said, waving off the concern before it could be spoken aloud. "You are fine until the day you are not," Garrick said. "This cannot continue. The Draven Pack grows more desperate, which makes them more dangerous. You need alliances. You need a mate who can strengthen your position, someone whose family brings enough power that no pack in this land would dare to move against you." Cale's jaw tightened. This conversation was not new. Garrick brought it up at least once a week, always with a new argument, always circling back to the same conclusion. Marry, produce an heir, secure the throne before someone else tore it away. "I have told you," Cale said, walking toward the throne at the end of the hall. "I will not marry for politics." "Then marry for anything," Garrick said, following close behind. "Marry for convenience, marry for peace. I do not care what reason you choose, as long as you choose one before the Draven Pack succeeds where these fools failed." Cale sat down on the throne, resting his chin on his fist, and looked out over the hall, where servants were already scrubbing the blood from the floor and straightening overturned chairs, as though nothing had happened. This was the strange rhythm of his life. Violence, then order. Chaos, then calm. He had grown so used to it that a blade near his throat barely raised his pulse anymore. "Bring in tonight's gathering," he said, ignoring Garrick's pointed look. "Let us see what fresh nonsense the court has prepared for me this time." Garrick sighed, but he nodded to the herald standing near the doors, and within minutes, the great hall began to fill again, this time with women dressed in their finest gowns, each one escorted by a hopeful parent or an ambitious sibling, each one hoping to catch the eye of the Alpha King before the night was through. Cale had seen this parade more times than he could count. Every few months, the court insisted on hosting another gathering, another chance for the noble families of the Blackthorn lands to present their daughters, hoping one of them might finally soften the king's legendary indifference. It never worked, but the court never stopped trying, and Cale had long since stopped bothering to hide his lack of interest. The first woman to approach was Lady Bethan, the daughter of a wealthy merchant family, dressed in deep green silk, with her dark hair pinned up in an elaborate style that must have taken hours to arrange. She curtsied low, her eyes fixed on the floor in practiced modesty. "Your Majesty," she said, "it is an honor to stand before you." Cale studied her without much interest. "Lady Bethan," he said, "your father's ships bring good trade to this land. I hope they continue to do so." Her cheeks flushed pink, mistaking the polite comment for something warmer than it was. "Your Majesty is too kind. I only hope I might be of service to the crown in whatever way you find most fitting." "I am sure you will find plenty of ways to serve the crown that do not involve me," Cale said, and though his tone remained polite, the meaning was unmistakable. Lady Bethan's smile faltered, and she retreated with a stiff curtsy, her father already whispering apologies to a nearby noble, as though the rejection reflected poorly on the whole family. One by one they came, a daughter of a neighboring lord, a niece of the pack's chief healer, a young woman from a hunting family known for their skill with the bow. Each one offered compliments, gifts, promises of loyalty and devotion, and each one left disappointed, having barely earned more than a few clipped sentences from the king, who seemed to look through them rather than at them. Garrick watched the entire display from beside the throne, his frustration growing with each rejection. "You could at least pretend to consider one of them," he muttered under his breath. "I do not see the point in pretending," Cale answered just as quietly. "It would only give them false hope, and that feels crueler than honesty. Honesty is going to leave you sitting on this throne alone until the day someone finally gets their arrow past your guard." Cale did not answer that. He simply watched as the next woman approached, and the one after that, his mind already drifting elsewhere, to the reports of Draven scouts near the eastern border, to the guard who had been paid to betray him, to the quiet exhaustion that came from performing the same scene again and again with no different result. It was near the end of the gathering, when the crowd had begun to thin and servants were lighting the evening lamps, that Cale caught a scent that made him go still. It was faint, barely there beneath the perfume and smoke filling the hall, but it was unlike anything he had encountered before. Not quite wolf, not quite human, something else entirely, something that carried the sharpness of mountain air and the sweetness of crushed herbs, layered with something deeper he could not name. It pulled at something instinctive in him, some old and buried part of his nature that had gone quiet for years. He rose from the throne without meaning to, his eyes searching the crowd. "My king?" Garrick asked, noticing the sudden shift in his posture. Cale did not answer. He moved through the hall, weaving between clusters of nobles who parted for him automatically, his focus locked on that thread of scent even as it grew fainter with every step. He followed it toward the far side of the hall, near a servant's entrance half hidden behind a heavy curtain, but by the time he reached it, the trail had gone cold. He pushed through the curtain into a narrow corridor beyond, empty except for a single overturned basket of dried herbs spilled across the stone floor. Whoever had been carrying it was already gone. "Is something wrong?" Garrick asked, catching up to him, slightly out of breath. Cale stared down the empty corridor for a long moment before answering. "Did you see a woman come through here? Dark cloak, carrying herbs?" Garrick frowned. "No one has come this way except servants, delivering supplies to the healer's quarters." "Why do you ask?" Cale did not have an answer he was willing to say aloud. He crouched down, picking up a sprig of the spilled herbs, turning it over in his fingers as he tried to place the scent that still lingered faintly in the air. It was gone now, buried beneath dust and old stone. But for a moment, just a moment, it had been the most interesting thing he had encountered in months. "It is nothing," he said finally, straightening up and letting the herbs fall from his hand. "A servant, most likely. Nothing worth troubling over." But as he walked back into the hall, his mind kept circling back to that scent, to the way it had pulled at him so suddenly and so completely, unlike anything the parade of noble daughters had managed in years of trying. He told himself it meant nothing. A curious scent, quickly forgotten. Yet even as the gathering continued around him, even as more women approached with their careful smiles and rehearsed compliments, part of his attention remained fixed on that servants' corridor, waiting, without quite knowing why, for that scent to return. The gathering ended well after midnight, and Cale retired to his private chambers with a headache building behind his eyes, and a strange, unfamiliar restlessness in his chest. He stood at the window of his room, looking out over the moonlit grounds of the palace, the training yards and gardens washed silver in the pale light, and thought about the 3 assassination attempts, the Draven Pack's growing boldness, Garrick's endless insistence on marriage, and beneath all of it, quietly persistent, the memory of a scent he could not explain. He did not know then that the scent belonged to a woman who had entered his palace grounds under a false name, carrying secrets far more dangerous than any blade or arrow, secrets that would soon place his entire kingdom, and his own guarded heart, in more danger than any assassin ever could. Far below his window, in the small stone building where the palace healer kept her stores, a young woman in a plain gray cloak knelt beside a table covered in jars and bundled herbs, sorting them by lamplight with quick, careful hands. Her hood remained pulled low over her face even here, alone in the quiet room, as though old habits refused to loosen their grip even when no one was watching. She paused, suddenly, her hand hovering over a jar of dried lavender, and lifted her head slightly, as though she had heard something, or sensed something, though the room remained silent and still. For a long moment, she simply sat there, listening to nothing, before shaking her head and returning to her work. "You are imagining things," she whispered to herself. "No one noticed you. No one ever notices the healer's girl." But somewhere above her, in a grand chamber overlooking the palace grounds, the Alpha King stood at his window, unable to shake the feeling that something important had just slipped through his fingers, and that whatever it was, he intended to find it again. Sleep did not come easily that night. Cale lay awake long after the candles had burned low, staring at the carved wooden beams of his ceiling, replaying the strange pull of that scent again and again in his mind. He had faced down blades and betrayal without losing a single hour of rest, yet a single unidentified fragrance had managed to unravel his usual discipline entirely. He told himself, more than once, that exhaustion from the assassination attempt was simply playing tricks with his senses, that a man who had nearly died that day was entitled to a little confusion in his thoughts. But even as he offered himself that excuse, some deeper part of him refused to accept it. He rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, dressing in simple training clothes, rather than the formal attire his position usually demanded, and made his way down to the training yard, hoping physical exertion might clear the strange restlessness that had settled into his chest. The yard was empty at this hour except for a handful of early guards finishing their night watch, and Cale worked through his forms alone, sword cutting through the cool morning air, with practiced precision, muscles burning pleasantly with each repeated motion. It helped, for a while. There was a comfort in physical discipline that Cale had relied on since childhood, a place where his mind could go quiet and his body could simply move without the endless churn of political calculation and constant vigilance that defined most of his waking hours. But even here, in the one place he usually found peace, his thoughts kept drifting back to that servants' corridor, to the spilled herbs and the fading scent, to the strange certainty that something significant had slipped through his fingers before he had even understood what it was. By the time the sun had fully risen and the training yard began filling with soldiers reporting for morning drills, Cale had worked himself into a state of quiet, simmering frustration with his own inability to simply let the matter rest. The next morning brought fresh trouble before Cale had even finished his first cup of tea. A messenger arrived from the eastern border, breathless and travel-worn, bearing word that Draven scouts had been spotted testing the boundary lines under cover of darkness, moving in numbers too large to be simple curiosity. Garrick arrived moments later, with maps already unrolled across the war table, his expression grim. "They are growing bold," Garrick said, tracing a finger along the border. "First the assassins, now this. They are testing how far they can push before you respond." Cale studied the map in silence, his mind only half on the border markings, the other half still tangled in thoughts of a scent he could not place, and a woman he had never seen. He forced himself to focus, running through strategy with Garrick for the better part of an hour, dispatching additional guards to the eastern watchtowers, and sending word to allied packs to remain alert. It was well into the afternoon before he found a reason, or perhaps merely an excuse, to walk toward the healer's quarters himself. He told himself it was simple curiosity about the herbs used in the border guard's wound treatments, nothing more. But as he approached the small stone building tucked near the edge of the palace gardens, his steps slowed, and his senses sharpened, searching without permission for that same elusive scent from the night before. The healer, an older woman named Mira, with silver-streaked hair and sharp, observant eyes, looked up in surprise as he entered. "Your Majesty," she said, straightening quickly. "This is an unexpected visit. I wanted to see the state of our medical supplies," Kale said, glancing around the small room, taking in shelves lined with jars and bundles of drying herbs. "With tensions rising at the border, I want to be certain we are prepared." "Of course," Mira said, moving to show him the stores, listing off remedies and treatments with practiced efficiency. Kale listened, nodding at appropriate moments, but his attention kept drifting to the corners of the room, to the door leading to a back storage area, searching for any trace of the scent that had haunted him since the night before. "You seem distracted, Your Majesty," Mira said eventually, watching him with the same sharp attentiveness she likely used to diagnose illness in her patients. Kale cleared his throat. "Forgive me. I have a great deal on my mind." "Understandable, given recent events," Mira said. "Though, if I may ask, is there something specific you are looking for? You have been glancing at that door since you arrived." Kale hesitated, unwilling to sound foolish by admitting he was chasing a smell from the night before, something so faint and strange he could not even properly describe it. "I was told a new assistant has joined your staff recently," he said instead, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to be certain all new members of the palace staff have been properly cleared, given the current threats against the crown." Something flickered across Mira's expression, there and gone so quickly Kale almost missed it. "My assistant is trustworthy," she said. "She has helped me greatly these past weeks, and her knowledge of herbs and remedies exceeds anyone I have trained in years. I would still like to meet her," Kale said, "for security purposes." "She is not here today," Mira said smoothly. "She often gathers herbs from the eastern hills in the mornings, and does not return until evening." Kale studied the healer for a long moment, sensing something guarded in her answer, though he could not say exactly what. "Very well," he said finally. "I will return another time." As he left the healer's quarters, he told himself again that this was nothing more than reasonable caution, given the recent attempts on his life. New staff near the palace deserved scrutiny, especially now. It had nothing to do with a scent that lingered in his memory like smoke that refused to clear. Nothing to do with the strange pull he had felt the night before. Nothing to do with the way his instincts, quiet for years, had suddenly stirred awake at the mere hint of a stranger he had never even seen. He almost believed himself. That evening, as the sun sank low over the palace walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet, a hooded figure slipped quietly through the servants' entrance near the eastern gardens, a woven basket of freshly gathered herbs balanced against her hip. She moved with practiced quiet, keeping to the shadows along the garden wall, her senses alert in a way that most people would never notice, constantly aware of every sound, every movement, every possible danger. She had survived this long by staying unseen, by making herself forgettable, ordinary, invisible. It had worked for years, moving from village to village, kingdom to kingdom, never staying long enough for anyone to look too closely, never giving anyone reason to wonder who she truly was or where she had come from. But something about this place felt different, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Twice now, she had felt it. A prickling awareness, as though unseen eyes were watching her, as though something in this palace had noticed her presence despite every precaution she had taken. She told herself it was simply the tension of the place, the whispered rumors among the servants of assassination attempts and rising threats from a rival pack, enough to put anyone on edge. Yet as she slipped through the shadows toward the healer's quarters, she could not shake the feeling that somewhere within these walls, someone was searching for her, and that despite everything she had done to remain hidden, she had somehow already been found. She paused at the door, glancing back over her shoulder at the darkened palace grounds behind her, and for just a moment, high above in a lit window overlooking the gardens, she thought she saw a figure standing perfectly still, watching the shadows with the patient stillness of a predator who had already caught the scent of something worth hunting. She pulled her hood lower and hurried inside, telling herself it was nothing, telling herself she was imagining things. But the alpha king of the Blackthorn pack had never been a man who imagined things. He had simply, finally, found something worth his attention. Inside the small stone building, the woman finished sorting her herbs and blew out her lamp, sitting for a moment in the darkness with her back against the cool stone wall, listening to the quiet sounds of the palace settling into night around her. She thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was to feel almost safe somewhere, even briefly, after so many years of movement and caution. Safety had always been a temporary illusion in her experience, a feeling that inevitably preceded some new danger she had failed to anticipate. She reminded herself of that lesson now, forcing herself to catalog the exits from her small room, the distance to the nearest gate, the fastest route out of the palace grounds should she need to disappear again on short notice. Yet even as she ran through those familiar calculations, some small, stubborn part of her resisted the urge to fully commit to leaving. There was something about this place, about the brief flash of golden eyes she had glimpsed across the crowded hall the night before, that made her hesitate in a way she rarely allowed herself to hesitate. She pushed the thought away firmly, telling herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more, the kind of fleeting interest that meant nothing, once weighed against the certainty of danger that always followed discovery. Still, as she finally rose to retire for the night, she found herself wondering, despite every instinct urging caution, whether she might risk staying in this place a little longer than she had originally planned. 3 days passed, and Cale Ashbourne found himself doing something he had not done in years. He was waiting. He told himself it was nothing more than diligence, the responsible caution of a king who had survived multiple attempts on his life and could not afford to overlook a single unverified member of his staff. That was the story he repeated to himself each morning as he found some excuse to walk near the healer's quarters, and each evening as he lingered by his window, watching the garden paths below for a hooded figure that never seemed to appear when he was looking for her. Garrick noticed the change first, as he noticed most things. "You have visited the healer's quarters 4 times this week," Garrick said, dropping into the chair across from Cale's desk without invitation, the way he always did. "For a man who claims to have no interest in matters of the heart, you are showing remarkable dedication to inspecting herb jars." "I am concerned about palace security," Cale said, not looking up from the reports scattered across his desk. "Especially with an assistant whose background has not been properly verified. Mira has vouched for her. Mira is a healer, not a guard. Her judgment on remedies I trust completely. Her judgment on potential threats to the crown, less so." Garrick studied him with the knowing look of a man who had spent 30 years learning to read every flicker of expression his friend tried to hide. "This has nothing to do with security, does it?" Cale finally looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "I do not know what you mean." "I mean," Garrick said, leaning back in his chair, "that I have watched you dismiss the most beautiful and accomplished women in this kingdom without a second glance, and yet here you are, chasing rumors of a servant girl who gathers herbs in the hills. Something about her has caught your attention, and you are too proud to admit it plainly." "You are imagining things," Cale said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "Perhaps," Garrick said, rising from the chair, "or perhaps, for the first time since I have known you, something has finally managed to interest you, and you do not know what to do about it." He left before Cale could argue further, which was probably wise, because Cale did not have a good argument prepared. He sat alone in his study, long after Garrick's footsteps had faded down the hallway, staring at the reports he was supposed to be reviewing, without actually seeing a word of them. It was not simply attraction, though he could not deny that the little he had gathered about her, the scent, the glimpse of a cloaked figure moving through shadows, had stirred something in him that felt distinctly like interest. It was something deeper and stranger than that. His instincts, the sharp animal awareness that lived beneath his human mind, had gone quiet years ago, dulled by the endless repetition of court gatherings and calculated diplomacy. He had assumed that part of himself had simply worn thin with time and disappointment, but it had not worn thin. It had been waiting, apparently, for something worth waking up for. In the days that followed, Cale found himself paying closer attention to the small, quiet corners of palace life he had long since stopped noticing. The servants moving through hallways with baskets of linens, the kitchen staff hauling water from the well before dawn, the healer's assistants delivering remedies to the guard barracks each morning. He had ruled this territory for 2 years, yet he realized, with some discomfort, how little he actually knew about the people who kept his palace running smoothly behind the scenes. He had always assumed such details were beneath his attention, matters better left to stewards and household managers. Now, searching for a single elusive woman, he found himself noticing everything and understanding, for the first time, how easily someone determined to remain unseen could move through such a large household without ever drawing notice. He decided, finally, to stop waiting for chance encounters and simply seek her out directly. If she truly worked for Mira, gathering herbs from the eastern hills each morning, then he would find her there himself, security concerns providing more than enough justification for the visit. He set out before dawn the next day, telling his guards he wished to inspect the eastern watchtowers, personally given the recent border tensions, which was true enough to satisfy them, though it was not the whole truth. The eastern hills rose gently beyond the palace walls, covered in wildflowers and low grasses that swayed in the cool morning air, and Kale made his way along the winding paths with more patience than he typically possessed, scanning the landscape for any sign of a hooded figure among the herbs. He found her an hour later, kneeling in a small clearing, surrounded by patches of wild lavender and silverleaf, her hood pushed back for once, dark hair falling loose around her shoulders as she worked with quick, careful hands, cutting stems and placing them gently into a woven basket beside her. Kale stopped where he stood, several paces away, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, found himself entirely unable to speak. She was beautiful, though that word felt inadequate for what he saw. Her features were sharp and striking, pale skin against dark hair, and there was something in the way she moved, efficient and graceful all at once, that spoke of both practicality and a strange, quiet elegance. But it was not simply her appearance that held him still. It was the scent, finally strong and clear, filling the morning air around her, that same impossible combination of mountain air and crushed herbs, and something else beneath it, something ancient and unfamiliar, that pulled at him, with a force he did not know how to resist. She must have sensed him then, because she went suddenly still, her hand freezing over the lavender, before she turned her head slowly, her eyes finding his across the clearing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Her eyes were a striking shade of gray, almost silver in the morning light, and they widened slightly as they took in his face, his bearing, the unmistakable presence of a man who was clearly not simply a passing traveler. Recognition flickered across her expression, quickly followed by something that looked distinctly like alarm. "Your Majesty," she said, rising quickly and dropping into a hurried curtsy, her eyes lowering to the ground, in a gesture that felt almost too practiced, too careful, as though she had trained herself to avoid direct eye contact with anyone of importance. "You know who I am," Kale said, taking a slow step closer. "Everyone in the palace knows the face of their king," she said, her voice steady despite the tension he could see in the tight line of her shoulders. "And yet you have managed to avoid meeting me for several weeks now, despite working within the palace grounds." He kept his tone light, curious rather than accusatory, though he was watching her closely, cataloging every small reaction, every flicker of expression. "I did not think the king had reason to notice a healer's assistant," she said carefully. "I have many reasons to notice anyone new within my walls, especially now," he said. "What is your name?" She hesitated, just slightly, before answering. "Ren, Your Majesty." "Ren," he repeated, testing the name, and something in him felt certain, without any real evidence, that it was not the truth, or at least not the whole truth. "And where do you come from, Ren?" "A small village to the south," she said. "Nothing of importance. I came seeking work, and Mira was kind enough to take me on. You have a gift for herbs, I am told. I have studied remedies since I was young," she said. "It is the only skill I have ever had much use for." Kale studied her, noting the careful way she chose her words, giving him just enough information to sound reasonable, while revealing nothing that could actually be verified. It was the kind of answer someone gave when they had practiced hiding the truth for a very long time. "You seem nervous," he observed. "I am simply unused to speaking with kings," she said, and for the first time, a faint smile touched the corner of her mouth, quick and almost involuntary, as though she could not quite help it despite her obvious wariness. Most days, the closest I come to royalty is delivering herbs to the kitchen staff. Something about that small, unguarded smile did more to unsettle Cale's composure than anything else she had said or done. He found himself, absurdly, wanting to see it again. "I will not keep you from your work," he said finally, stepping back, giving her space, though every instinct in him wanted to do the opposite. "But I would ask that you come to the Palace Healer's main hall this afternoon. As a precaution, given recent threats against the crown, all new staff are being asked to confirm their background with palace records." Her expression tightened, just slightly, before smoothing over again. "Of course, Your Majesty. Whatever you require." She curtsied again, lower this time, and Cale forced himself to turn and walk away, before his instincts could override his good sense entirely. As he made his way back down the hillside toward the palace, he could feel her eyes on his back the entire way, and he wondered, with an unfamiliar flicker of something close to worry, whether she would actually appear at the palace that afternoon, or whether he had just given a woman with clear reasons to hide exactly the warning she needed to disappear entirely. She did not appear that afternoon. Cale waited in the healer's main hall for nearly 2 hours, growing increasingly restless despite his efforts to hide it, while Mira offered increasingly unconvincing excuses about her assistant being delayed gathering supplies, caught up in errands, unexpectedly occupied with matters that kept shifting each time he pressed for details. By evening, it was clear she had no intention of coming, and Cale's frustration had curdled into something sharper, a mixture of irritation and a strange, unwelcome disappointment that he did not care to examine too closely. "You frightened her," Garrick said later that night, when Cale recounted the encounter with more irritation than he intended to reveal. "A woman hiding something does not respond well to a king demanding she confirm her background." "I only asked a reasonable question," Cale said. "To a woman who has clearly spent considerable effort avoiding notice," Garrick said. "You may have just confirmed for her that staying is more dangerous than leaving." The thought settled uncomfortably in Cale's chest. He had not considered, in the moment, how his position alone might read as a threat rather than simple curiosity. A king asking questions was rarely just a king asking questions, and someone as careful as Wren clearly was, would understand that better than most. He resolved to be more careful, though careful was not a word that came naturally to him. The following morning, instead of summoning her formally, he returned to the Eastern Hills himself, hoping to find her again, to explain himself properly, to somehow undo whatever damage his impatience had caused. She was not there. He returned the next morning, and the morning after that, each time finding the clearing empty, the lavender and silver leaf untouched, no sign that she had come to gather herbs at all. By the 4th morning, a cold suspicion had begun to settle in him, one he did not want to voice aloud even to Garrick. He finally cornered Mira directly, his patience worn thin. "Where is your assistant?" he demanded, standing in the doorway of the healer's quarters with an intensity that made even the unflappable healer take a small step back. "She has taken ill," Mira said, though the lie sat poorly on her tongue, her eyes darting away from his in a manner entirely unlike her usual steady confidence. "A fever. She is resting in the servants' quarters, and cannot receive visitors." "I do not believe you," Cale said quietly. Mira's composure finally cracked, just slightly, worry flickering across her weathered features. "Your Majesty, please, whatever your interest in her, I ask you to let it rest. She is a good girl, kind and hardworking, and whatever burden she carries is not one that concerns the crown." "Everything within my walls concerns the crown," Cale said, though his voice had softened. "Especially anyone frightened enough of me to disappear entirely, rather than answer a few simple questions." Mira studied him for a long moment, some internal debate playing out behind her sharp eyes, before she finally sighed, the fight draining out of her posture. "She left 3 nights ago," she admitted quietly. "After your encounter in the hills, she said it was no longer safe for her here, and she would not tell me where she intended to go." The words landed like a blow Cale had not expected to feel so sharply. He had chased away the one thing to catch his genuine interest in longer than he cared to remember, driven off by his own impatience, his own inability to simply let something remain a mystery a while longer before demanding answers. "She is gone," he said, more to himself than to Mira. "I am sorry, Your Majesty," Mira said, and she did sound genuinely regretful. "Whatever you were hoping to find in her, I do not think it was meant to be found so easily." Kale left the healer's quarters in a mood darker than any assassination attempt had managed to produce, and for the rest of that day, he found himself unable to focus on border reports, council meetings, or any of the countless responsibilities that demanded his attention. His mind kept circling back to the eastern hills, to gray eyes and a small, unguarded smile, to a scent that had awakened something in him he had thought long dead, and to the frustrating, maddening realization that he had let her slip away before he had even properly begun to understand why she mattered so much. He told himself it did not matter. A servant girl with secrets was hardly worth this much attention, from a king with a kingdom to protect, and enemies circling closer with every passing week. But that night, standing once again at his window overlooking the darkened gardens, he found himself scanning the shadows out of habit, searching for a hooded figure that he already knew would not appear, and understanding, with a growing sense of unease, that whatever had stirred in him over these past days had not settled back into silence simply because she had disappeared. If anything, her absence made the pull toward her feel even stronger, an itch beneath his skin that refused to fade, a question left unanswered that he could not simply let go. He tried, over the following days, to bury himself in the ordinary business of ruling. He met with border commanders about the continued Draven threat, reviewed trade agreements with allied territories, listened to petitions from local merchants concerned about rising costs of grain. He performed every duty expected of him with his usual competence, giving no outward sign that anything troubled him beyond the ordinary weight of governance. But Garrick, who had known him since boyhood, noticed the change regardless, the slight distraction in his eyes during council meetings, the way his attention occasionally drifted toward the windows overlooking the eastern hills, the uncharacteristic patience he showed toward matters that would normally have earned nothing but clipped irritation. "You are thinking about her again," Garrick observed one afternoon. Not quite a question. Kale did not bother denying it. "I chased away someone who saved lives, with abilities I still do not understand, simply because I could not manage my own impatience. That is not a mistake I am accustomed to making." "Perhaps," Garrick said carefully, "the mistake was not impatience, but assuming that a king's authority alone should be enough to earn trust from someone who has clearly spent her whole life learning that authority is rarely trustworthy." The observation lodged itself uncomfortably in Kale's mind, returning to him at unexpected moments over the following days, a reminder that whatever he had lost by frightening her away, he had likely lost it through his own failure to understand her circumstances, rather than any true fault of hers. He did not know it yet, but she had not gone far. She could not have, not with what was coming, not with the danger that was already moving toward the Blackthorn lands from more directions than either of them yet understood. Fate, it seemed, was not finished with the Alpha King and the mysterious woman who had slipped so quickly through his careful, guarded world, and their paths were about to cross again, far sooner, and under far more dangerous circumstances than either of them could have predicted. 2 weeks had passed since Alari's disappearance from the palace. 2 weeks during which Kale's frustration and restlessness had grown steadily worse, despite his best efforts to hide it from those around him. Garrick had finally suggested a hunting trip through the northern woodlands, arguing that Kale needed some distraction from both the mounting Draven tensions and whatever private trouble continued to occupy his thoughts, and Kale, against his better judgment, had agreed, hoping the familiar rhythm of tracking game through quiet forest trails might settle his mind in ways that council meetings and border reports had failed to accomplish. The morning had begun ordinarily enough, the small hunting party moving deep into the woodlands under a canopy of early autumn leaves, just beginning to turn gold and amber at their edges, the air crisp and clean with the promise of the changing season. Kale had allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to relax slightly, his senses tracking the movement of deer through the underbrush, rather than searching constantly for threats and betrayals hidden among his own court. That fragile calm shattered without warning. The forest floor exploded with movement the moment the first net dropped from the trees, and Kale Ashbourne realized, too late, that the hunting trip he had agreed to as a distraction from his darkening mood had been a trap from the very beginning. He twisted aside as the heavy net fell, avoiding it by a narrow margin, but the 2 guards flanking him were not as fast. They went down beneath the tangled weight of iron-weighted rope, and before either could cut themselves free, dark shapes emerged from the trees on all sides, wolves in their shifted forms, teeth bared, eyes gleaming with the particular hunger of men who had been paid well for violence. "Draven Pack," one of Kale's guards shouted, struggling against the net. "Your Majesty, run." Kale did not run. He had never run from a fight in his life, and he was not about to start now, even outnumbered, even with his own guards trapped and struggling behind him. He shifted mid-stride, his human form dissolving into the powerful, dark-furred shape of his wolf, and met the first attacker head-on, with a speed that caught the man by surprise. The fight that followed was brutal and fast, a blur of snapping jaws and slashing claws, the forest filling with growls and the sharp scent of blood. Kale fought with the practiced efficiency of a man who had survived countless battles, taking down one attacker, then another. But there were more of them than he had first realized, at least a dozen wolves emerging from the trees, and his two guards remained trapped beneath the weighted net, unable to help. A blow caught him across the ribs, sharp claws tearing through fur and skin, and he staggered, pain flaring bright and hot through his side. He recovered quickly, driving off his attacker with a vicious counterstrike, but he could feel his strength beginning to ebb as the fight dragged on, the sheer number of enemies wearing down his defenses faster than he could manage alone. Then, from somewhere behind him, one of the Draven wolves lunged toward his exposed flank, jaws open wide, close enough that Kale knew, in the split second before impact, that he would not be fast enough to avoid it. The blow never landed. A figure dropped from the trees above with impossible speed, moving faster than anything Kale had ever seen, faster than any wolf, faster than any human. She struck the attacking wolf mid-leap, her hands glowing with a pale silver light that Kale had no framework to understand, and the wolf was thrown backward through the air, as though struck by something far more powerful than a single woman's strength should have allowed. Kale stared, momentarily frozen despite the chaos still raging around him, as Ren landed lightly on her feet, her gray eyes blazing with an intensity he had not seen in their two brief encounters, her hands still glowing faintly with that strange silver light, as she turned to face the remaining attackers without a trace of fear. "Stay behind me," she said to him, her voice sharp and commanding, in a way that startled him nearly as much as her sudden appearance. Kale did not stay behind her. Whatever she was, whatever strange power she possessed, he was not the kind of man who hid behind anyone, king or not. He shifted back to human form just long enough to grab a fallen sword from one of his downed guards, then moved to fight alongside her rather than behind her, the two of them working in a strange, instinctive rhythm, despite having never fought together before. She moved like nothing he had ever seen, blending fighting styles that should not have worked together, striking with a physical precision that spoke of years of combat training, while occasionally releasing bursts of that silver light that scattered attackers, or knocked them from their feet entirely. It was not simple strength. It was something else, something that hummed with an energy Kale's instincts recognized as fundamentally different from his own wolf nature, ancient and unfamiliar, in a way that both intrigued and unsettled him even as they fought side by side. Within minutes, the remaining attackers, faced with a fight far more difficult than they had anticipated, began to retreat, dragging their wounded back into the trees and disappearing into the forest as quickly as they had emerged. Kale watched them go, breathing hard, blood still trickling from the wound at his side, and turned to find Ren already kneeling beside his trapped guards, cutting through the weighted net with quick, efficient movements, her strange glowing light having faded back to nothing, leaving her hands looking entirely ordinary once more. "Are you hurt?" she asked, glancing up at him briefly, before returning her attention to freeing the guards. "I am fine," Kale said, though the throbbing pain in his side suggested otherwise. "You should be asking that question of yourself." "What was that?" She did not answer immediately, focused on cutting the last of the ropes free, helping the two shaken guards to their feet, and checking them quickly for injuries with the same practiced efficiency she had shown treating wounds at the healer's quarters. Only once she was satisfied both men were relatively unharmed did she finally turn back to Kale, her expression carefully guarded once more, the openness from the fight already retreating behind familiar walls. "You should return to the palace," she said instead of answering. "Your wound needs proper treatment." "Ren," Kale said, using every ounce of restraint he possessed to keep his voice calm rather than demanding. You just saved my life, using abilities that no ordinary healer's assistant should possess. I think I am owed an explanation. She glanced at the two guards, who were watching the exchange with wide, uncertain eyes, clearly having witnessed enough strange things in the last few minutes to know that whatever had just happened was far beyond their understanding as well. Not here, she said quietly. Please, let me help you back to safety first, and I will explain what I can. Cale studied her for a long moment, weighing his desire for immediate answers against the practical reality of his bleeding side and the very real possibility that the Draven attackers might regroup and return. Finally, he nodded, allowing her to help support his weight as they made their way back toward the palace, his two guards flanking them protectively, despite their own scrapes and bruises. The walk back felt longer than the actual distance warranted, filled with a heavy silence that neither of them seemed inclined to break, though Cale was intensely, uncomfortably aware of her presence beside him, the way her shoulder occasionally brushed against his as she helped steady his steps, the faint scent of her, that he had chased for weeks, now finally close enough to fully register, strange and beautiful, and utterly unlike anything else he had ever known. By the time they reached the palace, Mira was already waiting, having apparently been alerted by a runner sent ahead, and she ushered Cale into the healer's quarters with brisk efficiency, cutting away his torn shirt to examine the claw marks along his ribs, while Ren hovered nearby, her earlier composure fully restored, betraying nothing of the strange power he had witnessed in the forest. The wound is not deep, Mira announced, after a thorough examination. You will need rest and proper bandaging, but you will heal well enough within a few days. Thank you, Mira, Cale said, wincing slightly as she began cleaning the wound. Could you give us a moment, please? I need to speak with your assistant privately. Mira glanced between them, something knowing flickering in her expression, before she nodded and stepped out, leaving Cale alone with Ren for the first time since the forest. You promised an explanation, he said, once the door had closed. Ren was quiet for a long moment, moving to the window and looking out over the palace grounds with her back to him, her shoulders tense with the particular stillness of someone bracing themselves for something difficult. What you saw in the forest, she said finally, is not something I can fully explain, not because I do not trust you, but because the truth places me in more danger than you can likely imagine, and by extension, places anyone who knows that truth in danger as well. I already faced down a dozen Draven wolves today, Cale said. I am not easily frightened by danger. This is different, she said, finally turning to face him, her gray eyes serious, in a way that made him understand, immediately, that whatever she was about to say carried weight far beyond anything he had anticipated. I am not simply a healer's assistant hiding a minor secret, Your Majesty. What I am is something that both wolves and humans have hunted for centuries, something so rare that most believe my kind no longer exists at all. Cale sat up straighter despite the pain in his side, his full attention fixed on her now. What are you? She hesitated, and for a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer entirely, might simply disappear again, the way she had after their encounter in the hills. But something in his expression, some quality of genuine, patient attention, rather than demanding authority, seemed to convince her otherwise. My people were called the Lys, she said quietly, an ancient bloodline that existed before the wolves and before the humans claimed these lands, tied to old magic that predates both. We were never many, even in the old days, and over the centuries, we were hunted nearly to extinction, by wolves who feared our power, by humans who feared what they did not understand, by anyone who saw an advantage in eliminating something they could not control. I have never heard of the Lys, Cale admitted. Most have not, she said, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. That is rather the point. We survived by disappearing entirely from history, by hiding so thoroughly that most consider us nothing more than old legend, if they consider us at all. My mother taught me to hide, to move constantly, to never stay anywhere long enough for anyone to notice what I truly am. I have followed that lesson my entire life. And yet you revealed yourself today, to save me. I could not simply watch you die, she said, and something in her voice, some quiet vulnerability beneath the careful composure, made Cale's chest tighten in a way he did not fully understand. Even knowing the risk, I could not stand by and do nothing. Cale studied her for a long moment, processing everything she had told him, the weight of centuries of persecution behind her careful, guarded existence, the courage it must have taken to reveal herself today, knowing exactly what that revelation might cost her. "Thank you," he said finally, "for saving my life. And thank you for trusting me with the truth, even partially. I understand what that must have cost you." Something in her expression softened, just slightly, surprise flickering behind her guarded eyes, as though she had expected a different reaction entirely, fear or suspicion, or demands for more information, rather than simple gratitude. "You are not afraid of me," she said, sounding almost uncertain about the observation. "Should I be? Most who learn what I am eventually find reasons to be," she said quietly. "Fear makes people do terrible things to what they do not understand." "I am not most people," Cale said, and though the words came out simply, he meant them with a weight that surprised even himself. "And I do not intend to become someone who repays a debt of saved life with fear or betrayal." She studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her gray eyes, some careful reassessment taking place that Cale could not quite read. Whatever conclusion she reached, she did not voice it, instead moving toward the door with the same guarded composure she had carried since their very first encounter. "You should rest," she said. "Your wound needs time to heal properly." "Ren," he said, stopping her before she could leave. "Or whatever your true name actually is. Will you stay? Not simply as Mira's assistant hiding in plain sight, but here, in the palace, where I can offer you real protection rather than the illusion of safety you have been surviving on." She turned back to him, and for a long moment, indecision played clearly across her expression, the pull of genuine temptation warring visibly with years of ingrained caution. "You do not understand what you are offering," she said finally. "Protecting me means defying centuries of law and tradition that forbid wolves from harboring my kind. It means making an enemy of anyone who learns the truth and objects to my presence here. It is not a simple favor, Your Majesty. It is a risk that could cost you far more than you realize." "I have survived 3 assassination attempts in 2 months," Cale said. "I am rather accustomed to risk by now." A faint, genuine smile broke through her careful composure then, small and fleeting but entirely real, and Cale found himself thinking, with startling clarity, that he would very much like to see that smile again, as often as possible, for as long as she was willing to allow it. "My true name," she said quietly, "is Alari, though I have not spoken it aloud to anyone in a very long time." "Alari," Cale repeated, testing the name the way he had tested Ren weeks before, though this time, something in him recognized instinctively that this name, at last, was true. "Thank you for trusting me with it." "I have not agreed to stay," she said, though her tone had lost much of its earlier guardedness. "No," Cale agreed, "but you have not left either." She held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before she finally nodded, just once, a small gesture that felt far larger than its size suggested. "I will consider your offer," she said, "but know this, Your Majesty. If I stay, and if the truth of what I am becomes known, the danger will not simply threaten me. It will threaten your entire kingdom, and everyone within these walls who chooses to stand beside me. Then we will face that danger together, when and if it comes," Cale said, with a certainty that surprised him even as he spoke the words. She left soon after, promising to give her answer within the week, and Cale spent the following days in a state of restless anticipation, entirely unlike him, his wound healing steadily under Mira's care, while his mind remained fixed on gray eyes and a name spoken like a secret finally set free. He did not know, as he waited for her answer, that the Draven Pack's failed attack in the forest had already set other, more dangerous events into motion. Whispers moving through rival territories about a mysterious woman with strange powers who had appeared at the Alpha King's side. Whispers that would soon reach ears far more dangerous than his own court, and draw the attention of forces that had hunted her kind for generations, forces that were about to converge on the Blackthorn lands with a hunger far more patient and far more ruthless than any assassin Cale had faced before. For now, though, he knew only that something rare and unexpected had entered his carefully guarded life, and that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself hoping, with a quiet intensity that unsettled him, that she would choose to stay. That evening, he told Garrick only a partial version of events, describing the ambush and the mysterious intervention that had saved his life, without revealing the full truth of what Ilari had confided to him in the healer's quarters. It was not that he distrusted his oldest friend, but rather that the secret felt fragile in a way that made him instinctively protective of it, as though speaking the full truth aloud, too soon, might somehow undo the careful trust Ilari had extended to him. "Whoever this woman is," Garrick said, pacing thoughtfully across Cale's private study, "she saved your life today, and the guards who witnessed it speak of abilities unlike anything in our histories. That alone earns her a debt from this crown that should not go unpaid." "I intend to see that debt honored," Cale said. "Be careful how you honor it," Garrick warned, though his tone carried more genuine concern than criticism. "Whatever she is, her abilities alone will draw attention from every corner of these territories, the moment word spreads of what happened in that forest today. You will need to manage this carefully, for her protection as much as your own standing." Cale nodded slowly, already turning over the implications in his mind, understanding that Garrick's warning, however unwelcome, carried genuine wisdom. Word of the ambush, and its strange resolution, would inevitably travel, whispered among guards and servants regardless of any official effort to contain it. The question was no longer whether people would learn something unusual had happened in those woods, but how much of the full truth might eventually come to light, and what consequences that truth might bring once it did. The 7 days following Ilari's promise to consider his offer passed more slowly than any week Cale could remember enduring, even accounting for the tense aftermath of previous assassination attempts. He threw himself into palace business with unusual dedication, hoping the distraction might ease the constant, nagging worry that she had already decided against returning, that his offer of protection had not been enough to outweigh a lifetime of learned caution. He reviewed border reports twice over, sat through council sessions with unusual patience, even accompanied Garrick on an inspection of the northern granaries that would normally have bored him within minutes. None of it fully quieted the restless anticipation that had settled into his chest since their conversation in the healer's quarters. Mira, for her part, offered little reassurance during those days, remaining carefully non-committal whenever Cale found some excuse to visit the healer's quarters and inquire, as casually as he could manage, whether she had heard anything from her former assistant. The old healer seemed to understand exactly what was happening beneath his careful questions, though she was gracious enough not to comment on it directly, simply offering a knowing look each time he departed, no wiser than when he had arrived. Ilari returned to the palace on the 7th day, exactly as she had promised, though Cale had spent every one of those 7 days convinced she would not come at all. He was in the training yard when she arrived, working through forms with a wooden practice sword, despite Mira's repeated warnings that his wound needed more time to heal, when he caught her scent on the afternoon breeze, and turned to find her standing at the edge of the yard, watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "You should not be exerting yourself," she said, by way of greeting. "That wound was deeper than you let on." "You came back," Cale said, ignoring her observation entirely, lowering the practice sword and crossing the yard toward her, with a speed that betrayed how much her absence had actually affected him over the past week. "I said I would consider your offer," she said. "I have considered it. And—" She hesitated, glancing around the training yard at the guards and staff going about their duties, all of them politely pretending not to watch the exchange between their king and the mysterious woman who had, according to whispered rumors already circulating through the palace, saved his life during the Draven ambush. "Perhaps somewhere more private," she suggested. Cale led her to a quiet garden path behind the palace, away from curious eyes and eager ears, where late afternoon sunlight filtered gold through the trees, and the only sounds were birdsong and the distant murmur of the fountain at the garden's center. It was a place he came to rarely, mostly because peace and quiet had become such unfamiliar luxuries in his life that he had almost forgotten how to appreciate them. "I have decided to stay," Ilari said once they were alone, "though I want to be clear about my reasons, and about the conditions I am asking for in return." "Tell me," Cale said. "I am not staying because I believe myself safe here," she said. "I am staying because you offered something no one else ever has, a chance to stop running, even temporarily, and because I find myself curious about what that might feel like." But I need you to understand that my presence here is a genuine risk, not simply to myself, but to your throne, your alliances, everything you have built. I understand the risk, Kael said. Do you? She pressed. Pack law is very clear on this matter, Your Majesty. The Lees were declared enemies of the wolf packs generations ago, after conflicts neither of us were alive to witness, but that still shape how my kind are viewed today. If word spreads that the Alpha King is harboring one of us within his own walls, you will face opposition not only from rival packs looking for any excuse to challenge your rule, but potentially from your own council and allies as well. Kael considered her words carefully, understanding the weight behind them, the genuine danger she was describing, rather than simple caution for caution's sake. He thought of Garrick, who would undoubtedly object strenuously to this decision the moment he learned the truth, of the noble families who had spent months trying to secure alliances through marriage, and would see this as an insult, of the Draven pack, already testing his defenses, who would seize on any justification to paint him as unfit to rule. I understand all of that, he said finally, and my answer remains the same. You will stay, under my protection, for as long as you wish to remain. Why? She asked, and the question carried genuine confusion, rather than simple politeness, as though she truly could not understand why any king would take on such risk for a woman he barely knew. You do not owe me this, even after the forest. I acted to save your life because I could not do otherwise, not because I expected anything in return. Kael was quiet for a moment, searching for words that could properly explain something he did not entirely understand himself. Do you know, he said finally, that in the 2 years since I took the throne, you are the first person who has ever made me curious about anything beyond the next threat, the next alliance, the next problem requiring my attention. I have sat through countless gatherings, surrounded by women, eager to become my queen, and felt nothing beyond polite indifference toward every one of them. And then you appeared, hiding in shadows, saving my life with abilities I still do not fully understand, and for the first time in longer than I care to admit, I find myself genuinely wanting to know more about the person standing in front of me, rather than the crown, or the alliance, or the political advantage they represent. Ilari's expression shifted, something soft and unguarded flickering across her features before she carefully smoothed it away again. That is a dangerous thing to admit to someone you have known for such a short time. Perhaps, Kael agreed. But I have found that dangerous things have a way of becoming the most worthwhile. She held his gaze for a long moment, and Kael watched something settle in her expression. Some final decision reached after what he suspected had been days of careful deliberation. Then I will stay, she said. But we do this carefully. I cannot simply appear as myself, as Ilari. The name Ren, and my position as Mira's assistant, will need to remain my public identity for now, at least until we understand how much danger truly follows this decision. Agreed, Kael said. Though I confess I much prefer your true name. A faint smile touched her lips. You may use it, when we are alone, though I would ask that you be careful even then. Old habits of caution are difficult to abandon entirely, even when I want to trust the safety you are offering. I will earn that trust properly, in time, Kael said. For now, careful is more than enough. Over the following weeks, a new rhythm began to settle into palace life, one that Kael found himself looking forward to each day, with an anticipation he had never associated with his responsibilities before. Ilari continued her work alongside Mira, treating minor injuries and preparing remedies for the household, maintaining her careful public identity as Ren, while gradually, in private moments stolen between his council meetings and her healing duties, revealing more of herself to Kael. He learned that she had traveled through more kingdoms than he could easily count, always alone since her mother's death many years before, always careful to leave before anyone grew too curious about her origins. He learned that she found genuine joy in small things, the particular scent of rain on dry earth, the intricate patterns of frost on winter mornings, the quiet satisfaction of successfully treating a difficult illness. He learned that beneath her careful composure lived a dry, quick wit that emerged more freely the more comfortable she became in his presence, teasing him gently about his tendency toward stubbornness, a trait she claimed to recognize immediately, given how thoroughly it matched her own. In turn, he found himself sharing things he had never spoken of with anyone else, the crushing weight of responsibility that had settled onto his shoulders far too young, the loneliness, of ruling a kingdom while feeling perpetually disconnected from the people around him, the quiet exhaustion of performing strength and confidence every single day, regardless of what he actually felt underneath. "You carry so much alone," Ellery observed one evening, as they walked together through the same quiet garden path where he had first asked her to stay, the setting sun painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. "Does anyone ever simply ask how you are, beneath all the duty and expectation?" "Garrick tries, occasionally," Cale said, "though our conversations tend to circle back to matters of state more often than not." "That is not the same as truly being asked," she said. "No," he agreed, "it is not." "How are you then?" she asked, turning to face him fully, her gray eyes searching his with a genuine, focused attention that made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. Truly. Not the king answering a courtier, but simply Cale, answering someone who was actually asking. The question caught him entirely off guard, and he found himself pausing, actually considering it rather than reaching immediately for some practiced, diplomatic response. "Tired," he admitted finally. "Tired of assassination attempts and political maneuvering, and gatherings full of women who want the crown more than they want me. Tired of being alone in a palace full of people who all need something from me." "And now?" she asked softly. "In this moment, standing here?" He looked at her, at the careful, genuine warmth in her expression, at the way she had somehow become, in just a few short weeks, the one person in his entire kingdom whose company he genuinely craved rather than merely tolerated, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tightly wound for years. "Less tired than I have been in longer than I can remember," he said honestly. Something bright and hopeful flickered across her face, quickly followed by a flash of old caution, as though she were reminding herself not to trust the feeling too completely. "We should be careful," she said quietly, though her voice lacked real conviction. "This is dangerous, Cale. Not simply the political risk, but this, whatever is growing between us. I have spent my entire life learning not to attach myself too deeply to anyone, or anywhere, because attachment only makes the eventual leaving more painful." "Perhaps," Cale said, reaching out to gently take her hand, an action that felt both entirely natural and terrifyingly significant all at once. "You will not need to leave this time." She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, something vulnerable and hopeful warring visibly with years of careful self-protection. "You cannot promise that," she said softly. "No one can promise that." "No," he agreed. "But I can promise to fight for it, with everything I have, for as long as you allow me to." Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply standing together in the fading evening light, her hand held gently in his, something unspoken but deeply felt passing between them. It was Ellery who finally broke the silence, though her voice had lost its earlier caution, replaced by something softer, more open. "I have not felt this way about anyone, in a very long time," she admitted quietly. "Perhaps not ever, truthfully. It frightens me." "It frightens me as well," Cale said. "I am not accustomed to wanting something this badly, or fearing its loss this much. But I find I would rather face that fear than continue pretending I do not feel what I feel." She smiled then, small and genuine, and utterly unguarded, the same smile he had glimpsed briefly in the eastern hills weeks before, and Cale understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that whatever risks lay ahead, whatever dangers her presence might eventually bring to his throne and his kingdom, he had no intention of letting her go. Not now, not when he had finally found something worth holding on to so completely. What neither of them could have known, as they stood together in that quiet garden, was that their growing closeness had not gone entirely unnoticed. Word had already begun to spread through certain corners of the palace. Whispers passed between servants and guards who had witnessed stolen glances and quiet evening walks, rumors that would soon travel far beyond the palace walls, reaching ears that had been listening for exactly this kind of opportunity, ears belonging to enemies both old and new, who understood precisely how to use a king's growing attachment against him. The peace they had found together, however genuine, however hard-won, was about to be tested in ways neither of them yet anticipated, by threats gathering just beyond the horizon, patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the weeks that followed their conversation in the garden, Ellery settled more fully into palace life, gradually shedding some of the careful, guarded habits that had defined her existence for so long. She began joining Kale occasionally for evening meals, though always in smaller, private settings rather than the formal dining hall, where curious eyes might notice too much too quickly. She continued her work alongside Mira, her skill with remedies earning quiet respect throughout the household, and slowly, carefully, small friendships began forming with other members of the staff, who had come to know her simply as Wren, kind and skilled, and quietly good-humored, once her initial wariness eased. Kale found himself, more than once, simply watching her from across a room during these quiet weeks, marveling at how naturally she seemed to be finding her place within his world, and wondering, with a hope he barely allowed himself to acknowledge, whether this fragile peace might somehow prove lasting, despite everything working against it. Weeks of quiet happiness had settled over the palace since Ilari's return, a fragile but genuine peace that Kale had allowed himself to enjoy more freely with each passing day. The border tensions with the Draven Pack had eased somewhat following increased patrols along the Eastern Territory. Council meetings had grown less contentious as the immediate crises of recent months faded into manageable routine, and for the first time since taking the throne, Kale found himself waking each morning without the familiar weight of dread settling immediately over his thoughts. He should have known, he would later reflect, that such peace rarely lasted long in a life defined so consistently by conflict and complication. The letter arrived sealed in black wax, carried by a raven that landed on the council chamber windowsill with unsettling precision, as though it had been trained to deliver its message directly into the heart of the Blackthorn Palace, rather than to any ordinary recipient. Garrick was the one who found it, and by the time Kale arrived in the council chamber, summoned by an urgent message from his advisor, Garrick's face had gone pale in a way that immediately set Kale's instincts on edge. "What is it?" Kale asked, crossing the room quickly. Garrick held out the letter without a word, and Kale took it, unfolding the heavy parchment to find a message written in careful, elegant script that somehow made the words feel even more threatening than if they had been scrawled in haste. "To the Alpha King of the Blackthorn Pack," it read, "we have long admired your strength and your steady rule, which is precisely why we write with concern regarding the company you now keep. It has come to our attention that a creature of the old blood, one of the vanished Lys, has taken residence within your palace walls, disguised beneath a false name and a healer's apron. We assume you are unaware of the danger such a creature represents, given the centuries of conflict between our kinds, and we offer this warning as a courtesy. Remove her from your protection within one turn of the moon, or we will be forced to take matters into our own hands, and inform every pack and every hunting lodge across these lands of exactly what the mighty Blackthorn King has chosen to shelter beneath his own roof. Consider carefully what such knowledge would do to your standing among your allies, and to the stability of your throne." The letter was signed simply, the Silvermark Hunters, a name Kale recognized only vaguely, from old stories and half-remembered histories, an ancient faction dedicated to eliminating threats deemed too dangerous for ordinary wolves or humans to face alone, threats that apparently still included Ilari's people, even after generations of believing the Lys extinct. "How did they learn of her?" Kale demanded, his grip tightening on the parchment until it crumpled slightly beneath his fingers. "I do not know," Garrick admitted, his earlier frustration with the entire situation now entirely overshadowed by genuine alarm. "But clearly, someone within these walls has been talking, whether out of malice or simple carelessness, and word has traveled far beyond anything we anticipated." Kale's mind raced through the implications, each one worse than the last. If the Silvermark Hunters knew, then it was only a matter of time before the knowledge spread further, to rival packs, eager for any excuse to challenge his authority, to noble families, who would see harboring a Lys as confirmation that their king had lost all sense of proper judgment, to enemies both old and new, who would use this revelation as a weapon far more effective than any assassin's blade. "We need to speak with Ilari immediately," Kale said, already moving toward the door. He found her in the healer's quarters, exactly where he expected, carefully measuring herbs into small paper packets for the household's use, and the moment she saw his expression, she set down her work entirely, her own face shifting immediately into careful alertness. "What has happened?" she asked. Kale handed her the letter without speaking, watching her expression carefully, as she read through the threatening message, her face growing paler with each line, until, by the time she reached the signature, her hands had begun to tremble slightly. "The Silvermark Hunters," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of old, deep fear that Cale had not heard from her before, not even during the Draven ambush in the forest. "I had hoped they no longer existed. My mother spoke of them sometimes, when I was young, always with genuine terror in her voice, more fear than she ever showed toward wolves or ordinary hunters combined." "Who are they?" Cale asked. "An ancient order," Elari said, setting the letter down carefully on the table, as though it might burn her fingers if held too long. "Dedicated entirely to hunting down and eliminating my kind, believing us too dangerous to be allowed to exist, regardless of whether any individual among us has ever caused harm. They do not negotiate, Cale. They do not accept mercy or reconsideration. If they have found me, they will not stop until either I am dead, or until they are convinced I no longer pose any threat, which for them means the same thing. They will not touch you," Cale said, his voice carrying an intensity that left no room for doubt. "Not while you remain under my protection." "You do not understand what you are facing," Elari said, and for the first time since he had known her, genuine desperation crept into her voice. "The Silvermark Hunters do not simply send letters and wait politely for compliance. If we ignore this warning, they will act, and their methods are far more ruthless than anything the Draven Pack has attempted. They will not limit themselves to threatening your throne. They will come for me directly, and they will not care who stands in their way, including you." "You speak as though facing them alone would be simple," Elari said, her frustration mixing with genuine fear for him now, rather than only for herself. "You do not understand how thoroughly they study their targets before ever revealing themselves. My mother once told me stories of an entire settlement of my distant relatives, hidden deep in a mountain valley for generations, discovered and eliminated within a single night because the hunters had spent years quietly mapping every exit, every defense, every weakness, before finally acting. They do not rush. They do not make careless mistakes. That patience is what makes them so much more dangerous than ordinary enemies." "Then let them come," Cale said. "I have faced assassins and rival packs. I will face this threat as well." "This is different," Elari insisted, her voice rising slightly with frustration and fear intertwined. "These are not desperate mercenaries hoping for a quick payday. These are trained hunters who have spent centuries perfecting the art of eliminating my kind specifically. They understand exactly how to counter whatever abilities I possess. They will not simply attack and retreat like the Draven Pack did. They will plan, methodically, until they find the perfect moment to strike, and by the time you realize the danger has arrived, it may already be too late to stop it." Cale took her hands in his, forcing her to look at him, rather than continuing to spiral through fear-based possibilities. "I made you a promise," he said firmly, "that I would fight for this, for us, with everything I have. That promise has not changed, simply because the threat has grown larger. If anything, it has only strengthened my resolve." "You could lose everything," she said quietly. "Your throne, your alliances, potentially your life. All to protect someone the entire world seems determined to see erased from existence." "Then the entire world is wrong," Cale said simply, "and I would rather stand against that wrongness than watch you disappear back into hiding. Running for the rest of your life, from people who have decided your existence alone, is a crime worth punishing." Elari stared at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her gray eyes, gratitude and fear, and a desperate, cautious hope, all warring together. "I should leave," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "It would be simpler for everyone if I simply disappeared before this threat can fully materialize." "Simpler, perhaps," Cale said, "but I am not interested in simple. I am interested in you staying, and in facing whatever comes together, rather than apart." Their conversation was interrupted by Garrick's arrival, his expression grim as he entered the healer's quarters without his usual formality. "There is more," he said. "Scouts have reported unusual movement along multiple borders simultaneously. Draven Pack activity to the east, unfamiliar riders spotted near the southern pass matching descriptions that could well be Silvermark Hunters, and now word from our allies in the northern territories that rumors are already spreading about the king harboring a creature of forbidden blood." "The rumors have spread that quickly?" Cale asked, alarmed. Someone wants this information public, Garrick said grimly, and spreading fast. This is not simply the Silvermark hunters acting alone. Someone within our own walls, or close enough to have detailed knowledge of the situation, has been sharing information deliberately, likely for their own political advantage. The implication hung heavy in the room. A traitor, someone with access to private palace matters, someone who had either sold information to enemies or was working directly with them toward some larger goal. Cale's mind immediately began cycling through the members of his inner circle, searching for anyone whose loyalty might have wavered, anyone with sufficient motive to betray him at such a crucial moment. We need to identify who is responsible, Cale said, before this situation grows any more dangerous than it already has. Agreed, Garrick said, though I would also suggest, respectfully, that we consider increasing security around Ren, or Ilari, or whatever name we are using currently, immediately and substantially. If enemies are moving on multiple fronts, we cannot afford any gaps in her protection. See it done, Cale said. Double the guards near the healer's quarters. No one enters or leaves without proper verification, and I want regular patrols throughout the palace grounds, day and night. As Garrick departed to arrange the increased security, Ilari remained quiet, her expression troubled as she processed the mounting dangers surrounding her presence in the palace. Cale moved to stand beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, and felt the tension coiled there, the fear she was clearly working hard to control. This is precisely what I feared, she said quietly. My presence here is becoming a genuine liability, not simply to myself, but to everyone around me. The guards you are placing to protect me, they now become targets as well. Your alliances, your standing among other packs, all of it is now at risk because of decisions made simply by me choosing to stay. You did not choose alone, Cale reminded her. I asked you to stay, knowing the risks even then, though perhaps not fully understanding how quickly those risks would escalate. This is not a burden you carry alone, Ilari. It is one we face together. I do not know how to simply accept that, she admitted. I have spent my entire life believing that my presence in anyone's life is inherently dangerous to them, that the safest thing I can offer anyone is my absence. Perhaps it is time to learn a different lesson, Cale said gently. One where your presence is not simply tolerated despite the danger, but valued precisely because of everything you bring with you, including the courage it takes to remain here, despite every instinct telling you to run. She looked up at him then, something shifting behind her careful composure, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the quiet room, while the weight of gathering threats pressed against the walls of the palace from every direction. Over the following days, the situation grew steadily more tense. Reports continued arriving of unusual movement along multiple borders, the Draven Pack apparently coordinating with unknown allies, possibly even the Silvermark hunters themselves, though the exact nature of any alliance remained unclear. Rumors about Ilari's true nature continued spreading through neighboring territories, despite Cale's best efforts to control the information, and several allied packs sent formal messages expressing concern, some more diplomatically worded than others, about the wisdom of the king's current choices. Cale found himself spending increasing hours in council meetings, defending his decisions to advisors and allies alike, some of whom argued forcefully that the political cost of protecting Ilari had grown too high, that the stability of his throne mattered more than personal attachment, regardless of how genuine that attachment might be. You cannot simply dismiss centuries of established law and tradition because of personal feelings, argued Lord Halric, one of his most vocal advisors, during one particularly tense council session. The precedent you are setting invites chaos, Your Majesty. Other packs will question every decision you make from here forward, wondering whether political judgment or personal desire is truly guiding your rule. My judgment remains entirely my own, Cale said firmly, though the criticism stung more than he cared to admit. And I have found nothing in this situation that suggests protecting an innocent person from unjust persecution represents poor judgment, regardless of ancient laws, written by people who never bothered to question whether those laws were just to begin with. The council chamber fell into uneasy silence following his declaration, several advisors exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to press the argument further against a king whose resolve on this matter had clearly hardened beyond simple persuasion. That evening, exhausted from the day's political battles, Kale found Ilari waiting in the garden, where they had shared so many quiet evenings over the past weeks. Though tonight, her expression carried none of the softness he had grown accustomed to seeing there. Instead, she looked resolved, determined in a way that immediately worried him. "I have made a decision," she said before he could speak. "I am going to leave Kale. Tonight, before this situation costs you your throne entirely." "No," Kale said immediately, the word carrying more force than he intended. "You do not have the luxury of simply refusing this," she said, though her voice trembled slightly with the effort of maintaining her resolve. "I have watched you defend me in council after council, watched your advisors question your judgment, watched allied pacts grow increasingly uneasy with every passing day. I will not be the reason your kingdom falls into chaos, or the reason you lose everything you have worked to build. And I will not simply let you walk away," Kale said, closing the distance between them. "Not after everything we have shared, not after everything I have promised you. Leaving now would not make you safer, Ilari. It would simply mean facing the Silvermark hunters alone, without any protection at all, which is precisely the outcome they are hoping to force." She hesitated, her resolve visibly wavering under the weight of his argument, and Kale pressed his advantage gently, taking her hands in his once more. "We are stronger facing this together," he said. "I have not spent weeks fighting for you simply to watch you sacrifice yourself the moment things become difficult. Please, stay. Let me continue proving that this fight is one worth having, together." Ilari's eyes filled with unshed tears, a rare crack in her carefully maintained composure, and after a long, tense moment, she finally nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly, as she made her choice once more, choosing to stay, despite every instinct urging otherwise. "Together then," she said quietly. "Though I fear, we are both underestimating exactly how dangerous the coming days will be." She was right to fear it, though neither of them yet understood the full extent of the danger closing in around them, or the betrayal already brewing within the palace walls, waiting for the perfect moment to turn a difficult situation into an absolute catastrophe. In the days that followed, Kale doubled the guard rotations throughout the palace grounds, insisted Ilari travel only with escort, even within the familiar safety of the eastern hills, and spent long hours with Garrick reviewing every possible approach the Silvermark hunters or the Draven pack might attempt. Yet despite every precaution, a persistent unease settled over the palace, servants speaking in hushed tones about the mysterious letter and the growing rumors surrounding the healer's assistant, guards watching the tree line with new wariness during their nightly rounds, the entire household holding its breath, as though waiting for a storm everyone could sense approaching, but no one could yet see clearly enough to prepare against fully. Ilari, for her part, threw herself into her work with renewed determination, as though staying busy might somehow keep the mounting fear at bay. She spent long hours cataloging remedies with Mira, walked the garden paths only during daylight hours as Kale had gently requested, and tried, with only partial success, to maintain the fragile sense of normalcy that had defined their recent weeks together, before the threatening letter had arrived and shattered it so completely. A full week passed, following the arrival of the threatening letter, a week defined by heightened security, careful diplomatic maneuvering, with allied territories, concerned about the rumors now spreading beyond the palace walls, and a constant, low-grade tension that never quite eased, despite no further direct threats materializing during that time. Kale had begun to wonder whether the Silvermark hunters intended their letter primarily as a psychological weapon, designed to fray nerves and sow discord through anticipation alone, rather than immediate action. Garrick disagreed, arguing that the Order's patience was simply part of a longer strategy, one that made careful preparation and investigation all the more urgent rather than less. The investigation into the palace traitor moved slowly, frustratingly slowly, given how quickly the danger surrounding Ilari continued to grow with each passing day. Garrick had quietly interviewed every member of the household staff with access to sensitive information, cross-referencing schedules and movements against the timeline of when rumors had first begun spreading beyond the palace walls. It was careful, methodical work, the kind Garrick excelled at, but it produced frustratingly few solid leads, only a handful of names worth continued suspicion, none of them conclusive. "It could be anyone," Garrick admitted one evening, reviewing his notes in Kale's private study, while Ilari sat nearby, listening quietly, as she often did during these strategy sessions, her presence no longer questioned by Garrick, the way it once had been. Over the past weeks, watching Cale's steadfast devotion and gradually coming to know Alari's own quiet strength and kindness, Garrick's initial resistance had softened considerably, replaced by a cautious but genuine respect. A servant paid well enough to overlook their loyalty, a guard with grievances against the crown, even a member of the council itself, frustrated enough with recent decisions to seek some form of retaliation. "What about Lord Halric?" Cale asked. "He has been the most vocal critic of my decision to protect Alari." "Vocal criticism in council is not the same as active betrayal," Garrick said. "Halric has served this crown loyally for over a decade. I find it difficult to believe he would turn to treason simply because he disagrees with a single decision, however strongly he feels about it." "Difficult to believe is not the same as impossible," Cale pointed out. "No," Garrick agreed, "it is not. I will continue watching him closely, along with the others on my list. But we should proceed carefully. Accusing the wrong person could create exactly the kind of internal division our enemies are hoping to exploit." Alari had remained quiet throughout most of the discussion, but now she spoke up, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps the traitor is not motivated by ideology or grievance at all," she said. "Perhaps it is simply money. The Silvermark hunters have existed for centuries, which suggests considerable resources at their disposal. A well-placed bribe could turn almost anyone, regardless of prior loyalty." "A reasonable point," Garrick said, making a note. "I will look into any household staff or guards who have shown sudden, unexplained wealth in recent weeks." The conversation continued for some time, strategies and suspicions discussed at length, until Garrick finally departed for the evening, leaving Cale and Alari alone in the quiet study, the fire crackling softly in the hearth casting warm light across the room. "You handled that well," Cale observed, watching her from across the room. "A few months ago, you would never have offered your thoughts so openly in a strategy discussion. A few months ago, I would not have trusted anyone enough to believe my thoughts would be welcomed rather than dismissed," Ellery said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "You and Garrick have both made space for me here that I did not expect to find, not after a lifetime of hiding. You belong here," Cale said simply. "Whatever legal complications or political dangers surround that truth, it remains true nonetheless." She crossed the room to sit beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, the familiar scent of her that no longer struck him as strange or unfamiliar, but instead, as something he had come to associate entirely with comfort, with home, with the rare peace he found only in her company. "I have been thinking," she said quietly, "about something my mother used to tell me, when I was young, and frightened of what I was." "What did she tell you?" "She said that hiding kept us safe, but it also kept us alone, and that eventually, every person has to decide whether safety or connection matters more to them. She chose safety, always, until the day it no longer mattered, because the hunters found her anyway, despite everything." Alari's voice caught slightly on the memory, old grief still present beneath years of careful composure. "For most of my life, I assumed that meant safety was the correct choice, simply pursued imperfectly. But now, sitting here with you, I find myself wondering if perhaps she had the choice backward entirely, if perhaps connection is worth the risk, even knowing it might not save us in the end." Cale reached out, gently brushing a strand of dark hair back from her face, his touch tender in a way that had become increasingly natural between them over the past weeks. "I cannot promise you perfect safety," he said softly. "No one can promise that, regardless of circumstance. But I can promise you that whatever time we have together, however long that proves to be, will be filled with genuine connection rather than isolated caution. I think that is worth choosing, even knowing the risks." "I think so too," she whispered, and then, in a moment that felt both entirely unexpected and utterly inevitable, she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently against his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though she were testing whether the moment was truly real, but Cale responded immediately, one hand rising to cup her cheek, as he deepened the kiss with a tenderness that spoke of weeks of carefully restrained feeling finally allowed to surface. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Ilari's cheeks had flushed a soft pink, and her gray eyes held a warmth that made Cale's chest ache with something that felt remarkably close to happiness, an emotion he had nearly forgotten how to recognize after years of guarded distance from everyone around him. "I have wanted to do that for quite some time," she admitted softly. "As have I," Cale said, a genuine smile breaking across his usually stern features, one that transformed his entire expression into something younger, lighter, freer than she had ever seen him look before. "Though I confess I was attempting to respect the difficult circumstances you were navigating, rather than pressing my own feelings onto an already complicated situation." "You have been remarkably patient," Ellery said, "for a man not typically known for patience, from what Garrick tells me." "Garrick exaggerates my impatience considerably," Cale said, though his smile suggested otherwise. They spent the remainder of the evening simply together, talking quietly about nothing of particular importance, small memories and observations shared freely between two people who had finally allowed themselves to fully embrace what had been growing steadily between them for weeks. It was, Cale reflected later, one of the happiest evenings he could remember in longer than he cared to admit, a rare pocket of genuine peace amid the mounting chaos surrounding them. That peace, however, proved short-lived. 3 days later, a message arrived from Mira, urgent and troubled, requesting Alari's immediate presence at the healer's quarters to assist with a serious illness that had suddenly struck several members of the kitchen staff. Alari left immediately, her healer's instincts overriding any hesitation, despite the increased security measures that had become standard practice over recent weeks. Cale, occupied with an urgent council meeting regarding continued border tensions, did not learn of her departure until nearly 2 hours later, when Garrick burst into the council chamber with an expression of barely controlled panic that immediately silenced the entire room. "Your Majesty," Garrick said, his voice tight with urgency, "Alari is missing." Cale rose from his seat so quickly his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor, with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden horrified silence of the council chamber. "What do you mean, missing?" "She left the palace grounds nearly 2 hours ago, responding to a message from Mira about ill kitchen staff," Garrick said, "but Mira never sent any such message. When I went to check on the situation myself, Mira had no knowledge of any illness among the staff, and no one has seen Alari since she left through the eastern gate." The room seemed to tilt beneath Cale's feet, cold dread flooding through him with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe properly. "The message was a trap," he said, his voice hollow with dawning horror. "It appears so," Garrick confirmed grimly. "Someone forged Mira's handwriting convincingly enough to fool the guard who delivered it, someone with intimate knowledge of the household's usual communication patterns. Whoever orchestrated this had access to information that only someone deeply embedded within palace operations could possess." "The traitor," Cale said, understanding crashing over him with sickening clarity. "They used our own security systems against us, exploiting exactly the kind of internal knowledge only someone we trusted could have provided." "I fear so," Garrick said. "I have already dispatched search parties toward every direction from the eastern gate, but Your Majesty, given the sophistication of this deception, I suspect we are not dealing with the Draven pack alone. This has the careful, patient hallmarks of the Silvermark hunters." Cold fury began building beneath Cale's panic, a rage more intense than anything he had felt during the previous assassination attempts against his own life. Those attacks had been aimed at him directly, threats he understood and could face head-on. This was different, an attack aimed at the one person who had somehow become more important to him than his own safety, orchestrated through betrayal by someone he had trusted enough to grant access to the palace's most sensitive information. "Assemble every available guard," Cale commanded, his voice carrying a hard, dangerous edge that immediately silenced any remaining hesitation in the council chamber. "I want the entire eastern territory searched. Every path, every hidden trail, every location within a day's travel of the palace. I do not care what resources this requires. Find her." "Your Majesty," Lord Halric began, clearly intending to raise some objection about proper procedure or measured response, but Cale's expression as he turned toward the advisor silenced whatever protest had been forming. "If you have any information relevant to finding her," Cale said, his voice deadly quiet, "now would be the time to share it. Otherwise, I suggest you assist in the search, rather than delaying it with questions of procedure. Halric paled slightly but said nothing further, and within minutes, the entire palace had erupted into organized chaos, guards mobilizing in every direction, search parties departing through every gate. Servants and staff questioned rapidly about any information that might prove relevant to Alari's disappearance. Kale himself led one of the search parties, moving through the eastern hills where Alari had once gathered herbs, retracing paths they had walked together during quieter, safer days, his heart pounding with a fear more consuming than anything he had experienced facing down assassins or rival packs directly. This was different, entirely different. The terror of losing something irreplaceable rather than simply facing danger to himself. As darkness began to fall over the search, with no sign of Alari found anywhere within the search territory, Garrick finally caught up with Kale's group, his expression grim in the fading light. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, pulling Kale aside from the rest of the search party. "We found something. A message, left deliberately where our scouts would find it, near the southern pass." He held out a folded piece of parchment, and Kale took it with hands that trembled slightly, despite his best efforts to maintain composure. The message was brief, written in the same elegant, threatening script as the earlier warning from the Silvermark hunters. "We warned you," it read simply. "Now you understand the cost of ignoring that warning. She remains alive, for now, though how long that continues depends entirely on your response. Come to the old watchtower ruins at the southern border, alone, 3 nights from now, prepared to negotiate her release. Bring guards or allies, and you will receive her remains instead of her freedom." Kale's grip on the parchment tightened, until his knuckles whitened, cold fury and desperate fear warring within him in equal measure. 3 nights. He had 3 nights to somehow devise a plan that would save Alari, without simply walking into whatever trap the Silvermark hunters had prepared. 3 nights to identify and neutralize the traitor who had made this betrayal possible in the first place. 3 nights to prove that his promise to protect her, made so confidently weeks before, had not been an empty vow destined to fail when it mattered most. "We will save her," he said, more to himself than to Garrick, though the words carried the weight of absolute determination rather than simple hope. "Whatever it takes, whatever risk it requires, we will bring her home." Garrick nodded grimly, understanding, without needing further explanation, that his king had just committed himself entirely to a course of action that would likely require every resource, every alliance, and every ounce of strength the Blackthorn pack possessed, regardless of the personal danger involved. "We should send word to our allies as well," Garrick suggested carefully, requesting additional support should we need it. "The Silvermark hunters are not an enemy we should underestimate, and 3 nights leaves little time to prepare adequately." "Send the messages," Kale agreed, but quietly. "I do not want word of this reaching anyone who might act rashly, or alert our enemies to any gathering response before we are ready to move. And find Aldous. If he has fled to warn the hunters directly, he may yet be within reach before he crosses into contested territory, where our authority no longer extends." Riders were dispatched within the hour, carrying carefully worded requests for discreet support from the handful of allied packs Kale trusted most completely, while trackers set out along every road leading south, searching for any sign of the fleeing former commander. Kale himself barely slept during those following nights, his mind constantly turning over strategy, contingency, every possible variable that might determine whether Alari came home safely, or whether his 3 nights of careful preparation would ultimately prove insufficient against an enemy who had spent centuries perfecting the art of eliminating exactly her kind. Behind them, the search continued into the darkening night, guards and scouts fanning out across the territory with growing desperation, while somewhere beyond the southern border, in a location neither of them yet knew, Alari remained a prisoner of forces that had hunted her kind for centuries, waiting to discover whether the connection she had finally allowed herself to trust would prove strong enough to save her, or whether her mother's old warning about the dangers of attachment had been correct all along. The room where they held Alari had no windows, only cold stone walls, and a single door reinforced with iron, and the chain binding her wrists had been forged, she quickly realized, with a metal specifically designed to dampen whatever strange abilities her blood carried, leaving her feeling weaker and more vulnerable than she had felt since childhood. She had counted the hours as best she could in the darkness, marking time by the intervals when a guard brought stale bread and water, though she suspected they deliberately kept the schedule irregular to disorient her further. She did not know exactly where she was, only that the journey here had taken most of a day, blindfolded and bound in the back of some kind of covered wagon, the terrain growing steadily rougher, until they reached what she guessed, from the sounds of wind and the particular cold dampness of the air, to be some kind of ruined structure near open, exposed ground. The Silvermark hunters who guarded her spoke rarely, and when they did, their words carried a chilling, clinical detachment, as though she were simply a dangerous specimen, requiring careful containment, rather than a person capable of fear or pain. One of them, an older man with pale, watchful eyes, visited her more often than the others, studying her with an unsettling scientific curiosity that made her skin crawl each time he entered the room. "Your kind fascinated me, even before we found you," he said during one such visit, crouching down to examine the dampening chains with careful attention. "So rare, so carefully hidden across so many generations. I confess a certain admiration for how thoroughly your people managed to disappear, even as I remain committed to ensuring that disappearance becomes permanent." "Why?" Elari asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "What have I done to deserve this? I have never harmed anyone. I spent my entire life hiding precisely to avoid conflict with your kind." "It is not about what you have done," the man said, with something almost like regret in his voice, though it did nothing to soften his resolve. "It is about what your kind is capable of, historically, when left unchecked. The old texts describe abilities far beyond anything modern packs could hope to counter. Abilities that nearly tipped the balance of power across these lands centuries ago, before our order was founded specifically to prevent such an outcome from ever repeating. We do not act from hatred, Elari. We act from necessity, as we understand it. Necessity does not require capturing an innocent woman and threatening the life of a king who has done nothing but try to protect her," Elari said, anger finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "The king made his choice when he decided to shelter you, rather than surrender you to us, the moment our warning arrived," the man said. "Whatever consequences follow from that choice belong to him, as much as to you." She spent long stretches of the following hours trying to recall everything her mother had ever taught her about surviving captivity, though most of those lessons had focused on avoiding capture entirely, rather than enduring it once it had already occurred. She thought of the small kindnesses Mira had shown her, the quiet comfort of the garden paths she had walked with Kale, the warmth of his hand in hers during their evening conversations, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that these memories steadied her more than any tactical thinking managed to accomplish. Fear remained, constant and heavy in her chest, but beneath it ran something sturdier, a determination not to let this captivity be the ending of everything she had finally allowed herself to build. When a younger hunter brought her evening meal, she studied him carefully, noting his obvious discomfort with his assigned task, the way his eyes would not quite meet hers, the slight tremor in his hands, as he set down the bread and water just out of her reach, before retreating quickly. Not every member of this order shared their leader's cold conviction, she realized, filing the observation away carefully, in case it might later prove useful. He left shortly after, taking with him the small amount of hope Ellery had managed to maintain, that perhaps reasoning with her captors might yield some path toward release. She was left alone in the darkness once more, her wrists aching from the chains, her mind turning over every possible way she might escape or somehow signal for help, though the dampening chains made even her most basic instinctive abilities feel muted and distant, frustratingly out of reach. She thought of Kale, of the promise he had made to fight for their connection regardless of the danger, and found herself torn between desperate hope that he would somehow find a way to save her, and equally desperate fear that any attempt to do so would only place him in mortal danger as well. She remembered her mother's old warnings about the cost of attachment, about how connection always seemed to end in loss, and forced herself to push the thought aside, unwilling to let despair claim her, while any possibility of rescue remained. Back at the Blackthorn Palace, Kale had thrown himself into planning, with an intensity that left even Garrick slightly alarmed by its ferocity. He had gathered his most trusted guards and advisors, poring over maps of the Southern Territory, searching for any indication of where the old watchtower ruins mentioned in the ransom message might actually be located, since no such structure appeared on any official palace records. "We found a mention in an old survey document," Garrick reported, spreading a weathered map across the war table, late on the second night since Alari's disappearance. "A watchtower ruin near the southern border, abandoned generations ago, after a border dispute rendered it strategically useless. It sits in contested territory, technically belonging to No Pack currently, which would explain why the Silvermark hunters chose it. No Pack has jurisdiction to object to their presence there."
"How quickly can we reach it?" Kale asked, studying the map with fierce concentration.
"A full day's travel, perhaps slightly less if we push our fastest riders," Garrick said, "which leaves us with barely enough time to arrive before the deadline in their message, assuming we depart within the next several hours." "Then we depart tonight," Kale said immediately. "Your Majesty," Garrick said carefully, "the message specified you come alone. If we arrive with any visible force, they may act on their threat before we can negotiate anything at all. I have no intention of walking into that meeting without a plan for exactly that possibility," Kale said. "But I also have no intention of arriving without sufficient force positioned nearby to act the moment circumstances allow. We will approach carefully, keeping the bulk of our guards concealed at a distance, while I proceed to the actual meeting point with a small, discreet escort, close enough to respond quickly if necessary." Garrick nodded, already sketching out logistics for such an approach, when a guard burst into the war room, breathless from running. "Your Majesty, Advisor Garrick, we have identified the traitor." Both men turned sharply toward the guard, who continued quickly upon seeing he had their full attention. "It was Commander Aldous, sir, captain of the Eastern Gate Guard. We found evidence of substantial payments received over recent weeks, along with correspondence hidden within his personal quarters that confirms direct communication with the Silvermark hunters. He is the one who forged the message that lured Alari from the palace, using his knowledge of the household's usual communication patterns to make the deception convincing." Kale's jaw tightened with cold fury. Aldous had served as a guard captain for nearly 6 years, someone Kale had trusted with significant responsibility over palace security, someone whose betrayal cut deeper precisely because of that trust. "Where is he now?" Kale demanded. "Fled, Your Majesty, sometime within the last several hours, before we discovered the evidence against him. We believe he has likely gone to join the Silvermark hunters directly, given the extent of his apparent cooperation with them." "Then he will be present when we arrive at the watchtower," Kale said grimly, "which means we can expect he has provided them with detailed knowledge of our palace defenses, our guard capabilities, potentially even our planned approach if he suspected we might attempt a rescue rather than simple negotiation." "We should adjust our strategy accordingly," Garrick said, already working through the implications. "If Aldous has warned them to expect a rescue attempt, we need an approach they will not anticipate, something that accounts for his knowledge of our standard tactics." The two men worked through the remainder of the night, refining their plan with input from several trusted guard officers, considering and discarding numerous approaches, before finally settling on a strategy that combined careful deception with genuine force, positioned to activate the moment any opportunity for rescue presented itself. Kale departed for the southern border shortly before dawn, riding at the head of a small, visible escort of just 4 guards, while a much larger force under Garrick's command moved separately, taking a longer, more concealed route that would bring them within striking distance of the watchtower ruins, without alerting anyone watching for Kale's more obvious approach. The journey passed in tense, mostly silent concentration, Kale's mind constantly returning to thoughts of Alari, wondering whether she remained unharmed, whether she understood that he was coming for her, whether the promise he had made in that quiet garden weeks before would prove strong enough to overcome whatever the Silvermark hunters had planned. They reached the outskirts of the ruined watchtower as the sun began sinking low on the second evening since Alari's disappearance, the ancient stone structure rising against the darkening sky like a broken tooth, weathered and crumbling but still substantial enough to serve as a defensible position for whoever currently occupied it. Kale dismounted at the agreed distance, instructing his 4 guards to remain concealed among the rocky terrain, while he proceeded the remaining distance alone, exactly as the ransom message had demanded. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and cold, focused determination as he approached the watchtower's entrance, watching carefully for any sign of movement among the shadows. A figure emerged from the ruins before he reached the entrance, The same pale-eyed man who had been visiting Alari's captivity with unsettling regularity, flanked by several armed hunters whose weapons, Cale noted immediately, appeared specifically designed for combat against shifted wolves, silver-edged and precisely balanced in ways that suggested considerable expertise in hunting his kind. "Your Majesty," the pale-eyed man said, offering a slight, mocking bow. "I confess some surprise that you actually came, given the obvious danger involved. Love, it seems, makes even kings foolish. Where is she?" Cale demanded, his voice carrying barely restrained fury. "Safe, for now," the man said. "Whether that remains true depends entirely on how reasonably you approach our negotiation. We are prepared to offer a simple arrangement. Surrender any future claim to her protection, publicly renounce any connection between the Blackthorn Crown and her kind, and we will release her unharmed, allowing her to flee wherever she chooses, provided she never returns to your territory again. And if I refuse those terms, then we proceed with our original purpose," the man said, his tone carrying genuine, unsettling calm. "Her kind represents a threat that cannot be allowed to persist, regardless of any individual's personal circumstances. We would prefer a peaceful resolution, but we are prepared for other outcomes should you force our hand." Cale studied the man carefully, cataloging the number of armed hunters visible, searching for any weakness in their positioning that might be exploited when the moment for action finally arrived. "I want to see her," he said, "proof that she remains alive and unharmed, before we discuss any terms further." The man considered this for a moment before nodding, gesturing toward the watchtower's entrance. "Very well. Though I would caution you, Your Majesty, against any foolish attempts at heroics. We have considerably more hunters positioned throughout these ruins than you can currently see, more than sufficient to end this situation permanently should you provide any reason for such action." Cale followed the man into the ruins, his senses alert for every detail, every possible advantage, every indication of how many additional hunters might be concealed within the crumbling stone structure. They descended a narrow staircase into what had once been the watchtower's storage cellar, now converted into a makeshift prison, and there, chained against the far wall, pale and exhausted but very much alive, was Alari. Her eyes widened with a mixture of relief and immediate fear as she saw him, understanding instantly that his presence here meant he had walked directly into potential danger for her sake. "Cale," she said softly, her voice hoarse from thirst and long hours of silence, "you should not have come." "I told you I would fight for this," Cale said, his eyes meeting hers with fierce, unwavering intensity, despite the danger surrounding them both. "I intend to keep that promise." "Touching," the pale-eyed man observed dryly. "Now that you have your proof, Your Majesty, perhaps we can proceed to more practical matters." "Your answer to our terms?" Cale's mind raced, calculating distances, positions, the number of visible hunters within striking distance, the location of the exit, and most importantly, the timing of Garrick's concealed force, which should by now be closing in on the watchtower's perimeter, ready to move the moment Cale provided the signal they had arranged. "I have a counter-proposal," Cale said, his voice steady despite the tension coiled tight within him. "Release her immediately, unharmed, and I will personally guarantee that no wolf pack under my alliance will pursue conflict with your order going forward, provided you cease all hostile action against her, and any others of her kind who wish simply to live in peace." The pale-eyed man's expression shifted, surprise flickering behind his previously calm demeanor. "You believe yourself in a position to make such demands? You stand alone, surrounded by hunters specifically trained to counter wolves like yourself, with no visible support beyond the guards you left conveniently distant from this location." "I am not entirely alone," Cale said, and as the words left his mouth, he raised his hand in the prearranged signal, and the ruins around them erupted into sudden, violent motion, as Garrick's concealed forces surged forward from every direction, catching the Silvermark hunters entirely by surprise, despite their earlier confidence in superior positioning. The pale-eyed man's expression twisted with fury and disbelief as chaos erupted around them, hunters and Blackthorn guards clashing violently throughout the ruined watchtower, and Cale moved instantly, shifting mid-motion into his powerful wolf form and lunging toward Alari's chains, tearing through the dampening metal with a ferocity born of desperate urgency and cold, protective fury. The dampening chains resisted for a moment before finally splitting apart under the force of Kale's jaws, and Alari stumbled forward, her limbs weak from days of confinement, but her resolve utterly unbroken. Around them, the sounds of clashing steel and shouted commands echoed through the crumbling stone chamber. Guards and hunters locked in fierce combat throughout the ruins above, the entire structure seeming to shudder faintly with the violence of the confrontation. "Can you stand?" Kale asked, shifting briefly to human form, his hands steadying her shoulders with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding them. "I can do more than stand," Alari said, and even through her exhaustion, a fierce light had returned to her gray eyes, the same determined spirit that had first drawn his attention in that crowded hall so many weeks before. "Get me out of this cellar, and I will show you exactly how much fight remains in me." The battle for Alari's freedom, and for both their lives, had truly begun. The chains fell away from Alari's wrists, just as a hunter's blade came slicing down toward Kale's exposed back, and she reacted instantly, years of hidden instinct finally freed from the dampening metal, catching the hunter's wrist and twisting with enough force to send the blade clattering harmlessly across the stone floor. "Behind you," she gasped, her voice still hoarse, but carrying urgent warning, as another hunter rushed toward them from the narrow staircase. Kale spun in his wolf form, meeting the second attacker with a snarling ferocity that sent the man stumbling backward before he could bring his weapon to bear. Around them, the sounds of battle echoed through the ruined watchtower, Garrick's forces clashing with the Silvermark hunters in the cellar above and throughout the crumbling structure, the element of surprise having given the Blackthorn guards a crucial early advantage. "Can you fight?" Kale asked, shifting briefly back to human form long enough to speak clearly, his eyes scanning her for any sign of serious injury, despite the urgency of their situation. "I can fight," Alari confirmed, though her legs still felt unsteady from days of confinement, weakness lingering in her limbs, even as the dampening chain's effects began to fade now that they no longer touched her skin. "Though I will need a moment to fully recover my strength." "Stay close to me," Kale said, shifting back to his wolf form as more hunters began converging on their position, apparently having received word that their prisoner had been freed. "We need to reach the surface and regroup with Garrick's main force." They fought their way toward the narrow staircase together, Kale's powerful wolf form clearing a path through the chaos, while Alari, her strength gradually returning, used what abilities she could manage to deflect and disarm attackers who came too close, the pale silver light around her hands flickering weakly at first, before growing steadily brighter as her confinement's effects continued fading. The narrow staircase proved a difficult passage, barely wide enough for two to fight side by side, and Kale found himself grateful for the confined space, which prevented the hunters from overwhelming them with sheer numbers, even as more attackers continued converging on their position from above. Alari fought with a controlled precision that spoke of considerable training somewhere in her past, her silver light flaring brighter now, strong enough to throw an attacking hunter clear off his feet and into the stone wall, with enough force to end his participation in the fight entirely. "Your mother taught you well," Kale said between exchanges, genuine admiration cutting through his focused concentration on the battle. "She taught me survival," Alari corrected, ducking beneath a hunter's blade and countering with a sharp strike that sent the man staggering backward. "I am only now learning what it feels like to fight for something worth protecting, rather than simply running from something worth fearing." They emerged from the cellar into the main level of the ruined watchtower, to find the battle raging fiercely throughout the structure. Blackthorn guards fighting hard against a Silvermark force that, despite the initial surprise, had proven more numerous and better prepared than Kale had initially estimated. Garrick fought near the entrance, his blade moving with practiced precision as he cut down attacker after attacker, though even his considerable skill showed signs of strain against the sheer volume of hunters pressing forward. "Your Majesty," Garrick called out upon spotting them, relief evident in his voice despite the chaos surrounding him. "You have her. Good. We need to fall back to the perimeter. This position is becoming increasingly difficult to hold." Before Kale could respond, a familiar voice cut through the chaos, cold and filled with bitter resentment. "Running already, Your Majesty." "I had hoped for a more satisfying confrontation, given everything I sacrificed to arrange this opportunity." Commander Aldous emerged from a side passage, his blade already drawn, his expression twisted with an anger that seemed to run far deeper than simple mercenary motivation. Kale shifted back to human form, positioning himself protectively between Aldous and Ilari, despite the ongoing battle surrounding them. "Why?" Kale demanded, genuine confusion mixing with his fury. 6 years of loyal service, and you betray everything for this? "Loyal service that earned me nothing," Aldous spat, "while you spent weeks fawning over a creature that should never have been allowed near this palace, let alone protected by the crown itself. My family has served the Blackthorn Pack for 3 generations, and what has it earned us? Modest wages and empty gratitude, while you risk everything we have built, for a woman who is not even truly one of us." "So you sold your loyalty for coin," Kale said, disgust evident in his voice. "I sold my loyalty for a future my children might actually inherit," Aldous shot back, "rather than watching this pack collapse into chaos because its king could not control his own foolish heart. The Silvermark hunters offered enough gold to secure my family's future for generations, in exchange for information any reasonable person should have provided freely, given the danger she represents." "She has harmed no one," Ilari said, stepping forward despite Kale's instinctive attempt to keep her shielded behind him. "I have spent my entire life avoiding conflict, hurting no one, asking nothing from anyone. Whatever danger you believe I represent exists only in old fears, passed down through generations, who never bothered to question whether those fears were justified." "Pretty words," Aldous sneered, "from a creature whose very existence has already cost this kingdom stability, alliances, and now very nearly the king's own life. Save your defense for someone who still believes it matters." He lunged forward suddenly, blade aimed directly at Ilari, and Kale moved instinctively, shifting mid-motion to intercept the attack, his powerful jaws closing around Aldous' sword arm with enough force to send the blade spinning away uselessly across the stone floor. Aldous cried out in pain, stumbling backward, cradling his injured arm against his chest. "You will face proper judgment for this betrayal," Kale growled, shifting back to human form, standing over the former commander with cold, controlled fury. "Guards, take him into custody." 2 nearby Blackthorn soldiers moved quickly to restrain Aldous, dragging him away despite his continued protests, his earlier defiance crumbling into desperate pleading as the reality of his situation finally settled over him. Kale watched him go with a heavy heart, the betrayal cutting deeper than he wanted to acknowledge in the midst of ongoing battle, before turning his attention back to the larger conflict still raging throughout the Watchtower ruins. "Your Majesty," Garrick called urgently. "The pale-eyed leader. He is attempting to flee through the Eastern Passage. If he escapes, the Silvermark hunters will simply regroup and continue this threat indefinitely." Kale's gaze snapped toward the direction Garrick indicated, spotting the hunter's leader moving swiftly through the chaos toward a narrow eastern exit, clearly attempting to escape the battle before it turned decisively against his forces. Something in Kale understood immediately, that allowing this man to escape would mean this threat never truly ended, that the Silvermark hunters would simply regroup, reorganize, and eventually return, with renewed determination and better preparation. "Ellery, stay with Garrick," Kale said, already moving toward the Eastern Passage. "I am coming with you," Ellery said firmly, falling into step beside him despite his instinctive protest. "This threat exists because of what I am, Kale. I will not simply stand aside while others fight to resolve it." There was no time to argue further as they pursued the fleeing leader through the crumbling passage, emerging into the open air, beyond the Watchtower's eastern wall, just as the man reached a waiting horse, clearly prepared in advance for exactly this kind of emergency escape. "Stop," Kale commanded, his wolf form already emerging as he closed the remaining distance with powerful, rapid strides. The pale-eyed man turned, drawing a strange, silver-edged weapon from beneath his cloak, one that hummed faintly with the same kind of dampening energy that had bound Ilari's chains within the cellar below. "You have won this battle," he said, his composure remarkably intact despite the chaos and clear defeat surrounding his forces. "But you have not won this war, Your Majesty. Our order has existed for centuries, hunting creatures like her, across countless generations. We will not simply cease our purpose because of one failed engagement." "Then perhaps it is time your order reconsidered its purpose entirely," Ellery said, stepping forward despite the obvious danger of the weapon aimed toward her, her voice carrying a strength and conviction Kale had not heard from her before, born from days of captivity and a growing refusal to remain silent about the injustice she had endured. You speak of ancient threats and historical dangers, but look at what your pursuit of that old fear has actually accomplished. You have killed innocent people for generations, hunted an entire bloodline nearly to extinction. And for what? I have never harmed anyone. My mother never harmed anyone. Whatever crimes your order believes it is preventing, you are the ones causing genuine, ongoing harm, generation after generation, in the name of preventing a threat that exists now only in old fears rather than present reality. The pale-eyed man's expression flickered, something almost like doubt crossing his features before his resolve visibly hardened once more. Perhaps you speak truth, he acknowledged, surprising both Kale and Ilari with the admission. Or perhaps you are simply skilled at manipulation, as your kind was once known to be. I cannot risk my order's entire purpose on the word of a single individual, regardless of how convincing her argument might sound. Then risk it on evidence instead, Kale said, moving to stand beside Ilari, presenting a united front against the hunter's remaining resolve. Investigate her thoroughly, if you must. Examine every claim. Verify everything she has told you about her life, her actions, her complete absence of any genuine threat to anyone. If you find evidence of actual danger, I will not stand in the way of justified action. But if you find, as I suspect you will, that she represents exactly what she claims, an innocent person persecuted for nothing more than an accident of birth, then perhaps your order's purpose deserves genuine reconsideration. The man studied them both for a long, tense moment, his weapon still raised, the sounds of battle gradually quieting behind them, as Garrick's forces finished securing victory within the watchtower ruins. Finally, something shifted in his expression, exhaustion and uncertainty replacing his earlier cold determination. This is not over, he said finally, lowering his weapon slightly, though not entirely. But perhaps it deserves more careful consideration than I have previously allowed. I will bring your words to my order's council. Whether they choose to listen remains beyond my control. That is all I ask, Ilari said quietly. A chance to be judged on genuine evidence rather than centuries-old fear. The man nodded slowly, then turned, mounting his horse and riding swiftly away into the deepening darkness, leaving behind a battlefield gradually settling into exhausted quiet, as the last remaining hunters, realizing their leader had retreated, began surrendering or fleeing in turn. Kale turned to Ilari, relief and exhaustion washing over him in equal measure, now that the immediate danger had finally passed. Are you truly unharmed? He asked, his hands moving gently to check for injuries, despite her earlier assurance. Tired, she admitted, swaying slightly on her feet as the last of her adrenaline began fading. And thirsty, and in need of proper rest. But alive, and free, thanks to you, and everyone who came to find me. Kale pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close, despite the blood and dust covering them both, relief flooding through him, with an intensity that left him momentarily unable to speak. I was terrified I would not reach you in time, he admitted quietly, his voice rough with emotion. He rarely allowed himself to express so openly. You reached me, Ilari said softly, leaning into his embrace, exactly as you promised you would. They stood together for a long moment amid the aftermath of battle, the ruined watchtower behind them, Garrick's forces beginning the work of securing prisoners and treating the wounded, while somewhere in the distance, the pale-eyed hunter rode away carrying words that might, if his order chose to listen, finally begin unraveling centuries of unjust persecution. The immediate danger had passed, but Kale understood, even in this moment of relief and reunion, that the path ahead remained far from simple. Aldous' betrayal would need to be addressed formally. The political consequences of tonight's battle would ripple through Allied territories in ways that required careful management, and the question of whether the Silvermark hunters would truly reconsider their ancient purpose remained entirely uncertain. But for tonight at least, Ilari was safe, held securely in his arms, and that alone felt like victory enough to carry them both through whatever challenges still lay ahead. Garrick approached quietly, as the last of the wounded were tended to, and the surviving prisoners bound for transport back to the palace, his expression carrying a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph. The perimeter is secure, he reported. We suffered losses, Your Majesty, though fewer than I feared, given the scale of this engagement. I have already sent riders ahead to prepare the palace for our return. Thank you, Garrick, Cale said, finally releasing Alari from his embrace, though he kept one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders as they surveyed the aftermath together. None of this would have succeeded without your planning and your loyalty tonight. It is what friends do for one another, Garrick said simply, though the warmth in his voice suggested the words carried deeper meaning than their simplicity implied. He glanced toward Alari, offering her a respectful nod, entirely unlike the cautious skepticism he had shown her weeks before. I am glad to see you safe, my lady. This kingdom would have lost something valuable had tonight ended differently. Alari's eyes filled with quiet emotion at the unexpected warmth in his words, and for a moment, standing amid the wreckage of battle with dawn, beginning to lighten the eastern sky, she allowed herself to simply feel the relief and gratitude of survival, of rescue, of belonging somewhere that people had risked everything to bring her home. The journey back to the palace passed in weary but relieved silence, Alari riding close beside Cale, wrapped in a warm cloak one of the guards had offered, her strength gradually returning with each passing mile. Garrick led the main procession, escorting the captured hunters and the disgraced Commander Aldous under heavy guard, while word of the successful rescue traveled ahead of them, carried by swift riders sent to inform the palace of their return. By the time they arrived, the entire household had gathered in the main courtyard, relief and curiosity mixing openly on every face as they watched their king return with the woman whose presence had caused such controversy over recent weeks, now visibly proven willing to risk everything, including his own life, to bring her home safely. Mira rushed forward the moment they dismounted, pulling Alari into a fierce embrace before immediately shifting into her healer's role, insisting on a thorough examination despite Alari's protests that she felt well enough. Cale watched with a tired but genuine smile as Mira fussed over her former assistant, the old healer's obvious affection for Alari plain in every worried word and careful inspection. You will rest properly, Mira insisted, and eat a proper meal, and allow me to examine those wrists thoroughly, before I am satisfied you have not suffered any lasting harm from those chains. Yes, Mira, Alari said, a tired but affectionate smile breaking through her exhaustion, and Cale found himself grateful, watching the exchange, for the genuine community that had formed around Alari during her time at the palace, proof that whatever dangers her presence had brought, it had also brought genuine warmth and connection into lives that welcomed her completely. The following days proved as complicated as Cale had anticipated. Commander Aldis's trial for treason was conducted swiftly but thoroughly, the evidence of his betrayal overwhelming and largely undisputed even by his own testimony. He was stripped of his rank and title, his considerable payment from the Silvermark hunters confiscated, and sentenced to lengthy imprisonment rather than execution, a mercy Cale extended partly out of consideration for Aldis's uninvolved family, and partly because he found he had little appetite for further violence after everything that had already occurred. The political fallout proved more delicate to manage. Several allied pacts sent formal inquiries regarding the battle at the Watchtower ruins, some expressing concern about the precedent of open conflict with the ancient Silvermark Order, others more sympathetic given the clear evidence of unjust persecution that had come to light through the entire affair. Cale spent long hours in careful diplomatic correspondence, explaining the full circumstances, presenting evidence of Alari's innocence, and the genuine injustice of the centuries-old prejudice against her kind, gradually building support among allies who had initially expressed uncertainty about his decisions. Lord Halric, somewhat to Cale's surprise, proved among the first to shift his position following the rescue, his earlier political concerns apparently outweighed by genuine respect for the courage Cale had displayed in personally leading the rescue effort. I confess I misjudged the situation, Halric admitted during a private council meeting, several days after their return. I saw only political risk in your attachment to her, Your Majesty. I did not properly consider that a king willing to risk everything for someone he believes deserves protection speaks well of his character, regardless of the political complications involved. Perhaps there is wisdom in choosing connection over caution, after all, provided that choice is made with the courage and conviction you have demonstrated throughout this entire affair. Thank you, Lord Halric, Cale said, genuinely touched by the advisor's willingness to reconsider his earlier position. Your honesty, both in your original concerns and in this reconsideration, is valued. Other advisors proved slower to shift their positions, and Kale spent considerable time in careful, patient conversation with those who remained uncertain, listening genuinely to their concerns, rather than simply dismissing them, and offering thoughtful responses grounded in evidence rather than mere assertion. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this patient approach yielded far better results than the more forceful insistence he might once have relied upon, gradually winning over skeptics one honest conversation at a time. Not every complication resolved so smoothly, however. Word soon reached the palace that the Draven Pack, apparently emboldened by the chaos of recent weeks and the internal turmoil surrounding Aldous' betrayal, had begun massing forces along the eastern border once more, clearly intending to test whether the Blackthorn Pack's defenses had been weakened by recent events. They believed this the perfect moment to strike, Garrick reported grimly, during a tense council session. With Commander Aldous' betrayal exposed and public attention focused on the situation with Ilari, they likely assume our forces are distracted and our morale weakened. Then we will need to prove them entirely wrong, Kale said, his exhaustion from recent events giving way to renewed determination. Assemble our full military strength along the eastern border. I want a show of force substantial enough that the Draven Pack understands, without any doubt, that recent events have not weakened this kingdom, but rather strengthened our resolve. The following days brought intense preparation, Kale working closely with his military commanders to ensure the eastern border remained secure against any potential Draven aggression. Ilari, her strength fully recovered, insisted on contributing where she could, her healing skills proving valuable in preparing medical supplies for the gathering forces, though Kale remained understandably protective of her safety, given how recently she had faced genuine danger. You do not need to hover so constantly, Ilari said one evening, a teasing note in her voice as Kale checked on her for what felt like the 10th time that day, ostensibly to discuss border preparations, but clearly motivated by continued worry for her well-being. I nearly lost you once already, Kale said, though a small smile tugged at his mouth, despite his genuine concern. Forgive me if that experience has left me somewhat inclined toward excessive caution. I am not made of glass, Kale, she said gently, though her expression softened with understanding. But I appreciate your concern, even when it borders on overbearing. The Draven Pack's aggression ultimately did not escalate into open conflict. Faced with the Blackthorn Pack's clear show of strength and unified resolve, and likely having learned through their own channels of the decisive victory over the Silvermark hunters at the Watchtower ruins, the Draven leadership apparently reconsidered the wisdom of further provocation. Their forces gradually withdrew from the border over the following week, and formal messages arrived shortly after, offering carefully worded assurances of continued peaceful relations between the two packs, assurances Kale accepted with cautious skepticism, but genuine relief nonetheless. Garrick remained wary regardless of the formal assurances, insisting on maintaining heightened patrols along the eastern border for several additional weeks, a precaution Kale readily approved given how quickly the Draven Pack's ambitions had resurfaced once before. Peace agreements are only as reliable as the willingness of both sides to honor them, Garrick observed during one of their strategy sessions. I would rather maintain unnecessary caution than assume good faith from a pack that has already demonstrated its willingness to strike the moment it perceives weakness. A wise policy, Kale agreed, and one I intend to maintain, well beyond the immediate crisis. This kingdom cannot afford to mistake temporary calm for lasting security, not with enemies who have shown such persistent willingness to test our defenses whenever opportunity presents itself. With the immediate military threat resolved, and the political fallout from Aldous' betrayal gradually settling into manageable diplomatic correspondence, Kale found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, facing a genuine lull in the constant crises that had defined his reign since taking the throne. It was during this rare period of relative calm that he began seriously considering a decision that had been forming in his mind since the moment he had held Ilari in his arms, amid the ruins of that watchtower, relief and love flooding through him, with an intensity that had left no doubt about what he truly wanted for his future. He found Garrick in the palace library late one evening, reviewing correspondence from allied territories, and settled into the chair across from his old friend with a seriousness that immediately caught Garrick's attention. I need your counsel, Kale said. Not as my advisor managing political concerns, but as my oldest friend, someone who has known me longer than anyone else in this kingdom. Garrick set aside his correspondence, giving Cale his full attention. Of course. What troubles you? I intend to make Ilari my queen, Cale said simply, watching Garrick's reaction carefully. Not simply as consort or protected guest within my walls, but formally, publicly, defying whatever remains of the old laws and traditions that would forbid such a union. Garrick was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of what Cale had just declared. You understand the magnitude of what you are proposing, he said finally. This goes beyond simply sheltering her within your protection. A formal public declaration would require overturning centuries of established law, would likely provoke significant resistance from more traditional factions within our own pack, and would set a precedent that many surrounding territories may view with considerable alarm. I understand all of that, Cale said, and I have considered it carefully, not simply as an emotional decision made in the aftermath of relief and gratitude following her rescue, but as a genuine, considered choice about the kind of king I wish to be, and the kind of kingdom I wish to build. I do not believe laws rooted in centuries-old prejudice and fear deserve continued deference simply because of their age. I believe this kingdom, and every kingdom that has perpetuated such unjust persecution, is long overdue for genuine reconsideration of those laws. And Ilari? Garrick asked. Does she share this same conviction? Marriage to a king is no small commitment, particularly for someone who has spent her entire life carefully avoiding exactly this kind of prominent, public visibility. Cale considered the question seriously. I do not know her full answer yet, he admitted. I have not yet asked her directly, but I know that what exists between us is genuine, tested now through genuine danger and genuine sacrifice, on both our parts. I believe, or at least I hope, that she feels the same conviction I do, that what we have built together is worth the risk and the visibility that a public declaration would require. Then perhaps, Garrick said, a small smile finally breaking through his earlier seriousness, it is time you asked her directly, rather than simply theorizing about her potential answer with your old advisor. Cale found Ilari in the garden the following evening, the same quiet path where they had first acknowledged their growing feelings for each other weeks before, now bathed in the soft golden light of a peaceful sunset that seemed to promise, in its quiet beauty, the possibility of genuine happiness after so much recent turmoil and danger. You seem thoughtful this evening, Ilari observed as he approached, setting aside the book of herbal remedies she had been reading. I have been considering our future, Cale said, settling beside her, his heart pounding with a nervousness entirely unlike anything he had felt facing assassins or armed hunters. Not simply the immediate future, managing political fallout and border tensions, but the larger question of what I truly want, beyond this current crisis, beyond simply surviving each new threat as it emerges. And what have you decided you want? Ilari asked, something in her voice suggesting she already sensed the significance building in this conversation. Cale reached out, gently taking her hands in his, meeting her gray eyes with an intensity that carried every ounce of conviction he had built over these past weeks of danger and connection and hard-won trust. I want you, he said simply, not simply as a protected guest within my walls, hiding behind careful secrecy and cautious identity. I want you as my equal, my partner, standing openly beside me as my queen, sharing this kingdom and this life, fully and publicly, regardless of whatever resistance or complication that choice might bring. Ilari's breath caught, her eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something that looked remarkably like the hope she had once told him she was afraid to fully embrace. Cale, she said softly, you understand what such a declaration would mean. The laws, the resistance from traditional factions, the danger that even after everything we have already survived, remains ever present given who and what I am. I understand all of it, Cale said. And I choose it anyway, fully and completely, because I have never wanted anything, as much as I want a future with you, built openly and honestly, rather than hidden behind careful secrecy and constant fear. Tears filled Ilari's eyes, though her expression held nothing but genuine joy beneath the emotion. I spent my entire life believing that safety required hiding, that connection always ended in loss, she said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of everything she was choosing to release in this moment. But you have shown me, through everything we have survived together, that perhaps genuine connection is worth far more than the illusion of safety I spent so long chasing. Yes, Kale, I choose this future with you, openly, fully, whatever challenges it may bring. Kale pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that carried every promise he intended to keep, every fear they had faced together, every hard-won moment of trust that had brought them to this point. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, genuine joy shining clearly in both their expressions, Kale knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead in formally declaring their union before his entire court and kingdom, they would face them together, exactly as they had faced every danger since the moment Ilari first entered his life. The path forward would not be simple. Ancient laws would need to be formally challenged and overturned. Traditional factions would need careful, patient persuasion, and the wider political landscape would require delicate management to prevent this declaration from provoking renewed conflict, with territories still uncertain about the wisdom of embracing such significant change. But for the first time since taking his throne, Kale faced these coming challenges not with the weary resignation of a king managing endless crisis, but with genuine hope, genuine joy, and the unwavering certainty that whatever difficulties lay ahead, he would face them, with Ilari standing openly beside him, exactly where she belonged. They spent the remainder of that evening planning quietly together, discussing how best to present their decision to the wider court, which allies to approach first for support, how to frame the argument for overturning the ancient laws in a way most likely to earn genuine understanding, rather than simple compliance born of loyalty alone. Ilari proved a thoughtful, careful strategist in her own right, drawing on years of observing how different communities responded to fear and unfamiliarity, offering insights that even Garrick's considerable political experience had not fully anticipated. You should present it not as a demand, she suggested, but as an invitation to reconsider something worth reconsidering. People rarely respond well to being told their beliefs are simply wrong. They respond better to being shown a different truth and given space to arrive at new understanding themselves. Kale listened carefully, recognizing the wisdom in her approach, and by the time they finally retired for the evening, the foundation for their formal announcement had begun taking clear, careful shape, built not on the impulsive courage of a single dramatic moment, but on the patient, thoughtful groundwork of two people, determined to build lasting change, rather than fleeting declaration. The Great Hall had never held so many people at once. Nobles and commoners alike gathered shoulder to shoulder beneath the high stone arches, word having spread through every corner of the Blackthorn territory that their king intended to make an announcement of significant importance, one that would apparently challenge centuries of established tradition. Kale stood before his assembled court, Ilari beside him for the first time not hidden beneath a servant's cloak or a false identity, but dressed in fine, deep blue silk that complemented her dark hair and striking gray eyes, her chin held high with a quiet confidence that Kale found himself admiring more with each passing moment. Gone was the careful, guarded woman who had once avoided eye contact and hidden behind practiced modesty. In her place stood someone who had finally allowed herself to claim space openly, to exist without apology, and the transformation filled Kale with a fierce, protective pride. Garrick stood nearby, along with several members of the council, including Lord Halric, whose earlier skepticism had transformed over recent weeks into genuine, vocal support for the changes Kale intended to announce. Mira stood among the healers and household staff gathered near the front of the crowd, her expression openly emotional as she watched the woman she had come to consider, almost a daughter, prepare to claim her rightful place beside the king. People of the Blackthorn territory, Kale began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. You have all heard, in various forms and through various rumors, the events of recent weeks. The betrayal within our own walls, the battle fought to rescue an innocent woman from unjust persecution, the careful diplomatic work required to maintain peace with our neighbors despite significant upheaval. Today, I stand before you not simply to address those events directly, but to announce a decision that I believe represents the beginning of genuine, lasting change for this kingdom. He turned to look at Ilari, taking her hand in his before continuing, his voice carrying the full weight of his conviction. This is Ilari, of the Lys bloodline, an ancient people who have been unjustly hunted and persecuted for generations, based on old fears and outdated prejudice, rather than any genuine evidence of wrongdoing. I have come to know her not as a threat or a danger, but as someone of remarkable courage, kindness, and strength. Someone who has earned my complete trust, and, I will say plainly before you all, my complete love. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, though Cale noted with quiet satisfaction that the reaction carried more curiosity and cautious interest than open hostility, a testament to the careful groundwork he and his advisors had laid over recent weeks, through honest communication about the true circumstances surrounding Ilari's presence and the genuine injustice of the ancient laws that would forbid their union. I intend to make her my queen, Cale continued, formally and publicly, and in doing so, I intend to challenge the ancient laws that forbid such unions between wolves and the Lys bloodline. These laws were written centuries ago, based on fear and conflict that predates any of us standing in this hall today. I do not believe laws rooted in such prejudice deserve continued deference simply because of their age. I believe this kingdom is capable of better, of judging individuals by their actual character and actions, rather than by ancient fears attached to their bloodline. A voice called out from the crowd, one of the more traditional elders among the Pax Council, his tone carrying genuine concern rather than open hostility. Your Majesty, these laws exist for reasons our ancestors believed important. How can you be certain that overturning them will not invite the very dangers they were originally designed to prevent? Cale had anticipated such questions, and he answered with the same patient conviction he had used to gradually win over skeptics like Lord Halric over recent weeks. I cannot promise certainty about every future circumstance, he acknowledged honestly. No king can offer such guarantees about anything, regardless of tradition or precedent, but I can tell you what I have witnessed directly. I have seen Ilari risk her own safety to save my life, using abilities that could easily have been turned towards selfish or harmful purposes, but instead were used only in defense of others. I have seen her endure captivity and genuine danger with remarkable courage, and even in that captivity, argue not for her own release through violence or manipulation, but through honest appeal to reason and evidence. If this is the character our ancient laws would have us fear and persecute, then I believe those laws were built on a foundation of prejudice rather than genuine wisdom. Ilari stepped forward then, addressing the crowd directly for the first time, her voice steady despite the obvious weight of the moment. I understand the fear that has driven these old laws, she said. My own people have hidden from that fear for generations, learning to disappear rather than face it directly. But hiding has never truly solved anything. It has only allowed injustice to continue unchallenged, generation after generation, while innocent people suffered simply for existing as they were born to be. I ask you not to accept me blindly, but simply to judge me, and any others of my kind who wish to live peacefully among you, by our actual actions, rather than by old fears passed down without question. That is all any of us have ever truly wanted. A long silence followed her words, the great hall holding its collective breath as the assembled crowd processed everything they had heard. Finally, it was Lord Halric who broke the silence, stepping forward with the same conviction he had shown in council weeks before. I confess, I once shared the very doubts and concerns being raised here today, he said, addressing the crowd, rather than simply the king. But I have watched our king demonstrate extraordinary courage and conviction throughout this entire situation, and I have come to know Lady Ilari's character through observation and genuine interaction. I believe she represents exactly what our king claims, someone of genuine integrity, who deserves judgment based on her actions, rather than ancient prejudice. I offer my full support for this union, and for the broader reconsideration of laws that no longer serve this kingdom's genuine interests. His public declaration seemed to shift something in the crowd's mood, other voices gradually joining in support, some cautious, others more enthusiastic, until the hall filled with a growing murmur of general acceptance rather than the resistance Cale had initially feared. Not every voice offered full support, certainly, and Cale understood that genuine, complete acceptance would take considerably more time and continued effort to fully establish throughout the kingdom. But the foundation had been laid, honestly and carefully, and the response today suggested that foundation was strong enough to support the changes he intended to build upon it. Then let it be declared, Cale said, his voice carrying renewed strength and confidence as he addressed the assembled crowd, that the ancient laws forbidding union between wolves and the Lys bloodline are hereby formally challenged and set aside within Blackthorn territory. Let it be known that Ilari of the List shall become my queen, and that her kind shall no longer be hunted or persecuted within these lands, but instead, welcomed as they are, judged by their character rather than by old fears that no longer serve this kingdom's genuine well-being. In the weeks between the formal announcement and the ceremony itself, Chaol and Ilari traveled together to several allied territories, presenting their case directly to skeptical leaders and curious councils, answering questions honestly and patiently, rather than relying solely on royal authority to demand compliance. It was slow, careful work, and not every territory offered immediate support, but by the time they returned to the Blackthorn Palace to finalize preparations for their union, the wider political landscape had shifted enough that Chaol felt confident the changes he intended to champion would find lasting support rather than fragile, temporary tolerance. Mira insisted on personally overseeing many of the ceremony's preparations, treating the task with the same meticulous care she brought to her healing work, while Garrick handled the more formal diplomatic arrangements, ensuring that representatives from every allied territory received proper invitation and appropriate accommodation for the significant occasion. Even Lord Halric contributed enthusiastically, drawing on his considerable experience with court ceremony to help design a celebration that honored both traditional Blackthorn customs and the genuinely new precedent being established. The formal ceremony that followed in the weeks after that declaration was a celebration unlike anything the Blackthorn territory had witnessed in generations, nobles and commoners alike gathering to witness their king formally take Ilari as his queen, the ancient hall decorated in celebration, rather than the tense uncertainty that had marked so many recent gatherings. Mira wept openly with joy throughout the ceremony. Garrick stood as Chaol's closest witness, with genuine pride evident in every line of his expression, and even Lord Halric, once among the most skeptical voices in Chaol's council, offered his heartfelt congratulations with the warmth of someone who had genuinely come to believe in the rightness of this union. Word of the Blackthorn King's decision spread quickly through neighboring territories, provoking a range of reactions from cautious curiosity to open admiration for the courage required to challenge such deeply entrenched tradition. Several allied pacts, inspired by the Blackthorn example and the clear evidence presented regarding the injustice of the old laws, began their own careful reconsideration of similar traditions within their own territories, suggesting that the change Chaol had initiated might eventually extend far beyond his own borders. Even more remarkably, word eventually arrived from the Silvermark hunters themselves, a formal message carried by the same pale-eyed leader who had faced them at the ruined watchtower, indicating that his Order's council had indeed reconsidered their ancient purpose following his report of everything witnessed during that confrontation. While the Silvermark hunters did not disband entirely, they announced a significant shift in their mission, moving from active persecution toward careful, evidence-based investigation of any genuine threats, rather than blanket condemnation based purely on bloodline. It was not a perfect resolution, and Ilari understood that old prejudices would likely take generations to fully unravel, but it represented genuine progress toward the justice she had spent her entire life believing impossible to achieve. On a quiet evening several months after the formal ceremony, Chaol found Ilari once again in their favorite garden, now unmistakably her garden as much as his, tending to a small collection of herbs she had planted there herself, no longer needing to hide her skills or her true nature behind careful deception. "You seem content," he observed, settling beside her on the familiar stone bench where so much of their story together had unfolded. "I am," she said, a genuine, unguarded smile lighting her features as she looked at him, gray eyes warm with a happiness that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. "For the first time in my entire life, I do not wake each morning wondering where I will need to run next, or how long before someone discovers what I truly am. I simply wake here, beside you, in a home that finally feels like it belongs to me as much as anyone else." "It does belong to you," Chaol said, taking her hand in his, the same gesture that had marked so many significant moments throughout their journey together. "As much as it belongs to me, perhaps more, given everything you have brought to this kingdom through your courage and your example." "We built this together," Ilari said softly, leaning into his embrace as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in familiar shades of amber and rose. "Every step of it, from that first strange encounter in the Great Hall, to this very moment. I could not have found this peace, this belonging, without you standing beside me through every danger and every difficult choice. And I could not have found genuine happiness, Cale said, without you teaching me that some risks are worth taking, regardless of the danger involved, simply because what waits on the other side is worth every difficulty required to reach it. They sat together in comfortable, contented silence, as evening settled gently over the Blackthorn Palace, the kingdom around them gradually adjusting to the significant changes their union had set into motion, old prejudices slowly giving way to new understanding, ancient fears gradually replaced by genuine judgment, based on character rather than bloodline. It had not been a simple journey, and Cale understood that challenges would undoubtedly continue to arise, as the full implications of the changes they had championed continued unfolding across the wider territories. But whatever challenges lay ahead, he faced them now with a partner whose courage and conviction matched his own, a queen who had transformed not only his own guarded heart but the very foundations of the kingdom he ruled, proving that even the most deeply entrenched traditions could be challenged and changed when genuine love and genuine justice demanded it. The Alpha King, who had once resisted every woman who sought his attention, had finally found the one whose mysterious beauty and quiet strength had stolen his heart completely, and together, they had built something far more lasting and meaningful than either had believed possible when their paths first crossed in that crowded, dangerous Great Hall so many months before. Their story, unlike so many that came before it in the long history of the Blackthorn territory, was only just beginning, built on a foundation of genuine trust, hard-won courage, and the unshakable belief that love, when fought for honestly and completely, could overcome even the oldest and most deeply rooted injustices standing in its way. In time, word of their union and the changes it inspired would travel far beyond the Blackthorn borders, carried by merchants and travelers into territories neither of them had ever visited, inspiring quiet conversations in distant halls about old laws and older fears, about whether centuries of tradition truly deserved the unquestioning loyalty so many had granted it without reflection. Ellery would never know most of those distant conversations, would never learn how many others of her scattered hidden bloodline found new courage to step tentatively out of hiding because of the example she and Cale had set. But she did not need to know the full scope of what they had begun. It was enough, each evening as the sun set gently over the palace gardens, to sit beside the man who had chosen her openly and completely, and to know that whatever came next, they would face it together, exactly as they always had since the night a mysterious scent first led an Alpha King down a quiet servant's corridor, in search of something he could not yet name.